Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 8 of the most disturbing true camping horror stories ever documented. These are not tales spun from campfire legends or internet folklore, but authentic accounts from individuals whose wilderness expeditions transformed into nightmarish ordeals that haunt them to this day. Each story draws us into the most remote corners of our wilderness, from snow-covered alpine peaks to isolated forest service roads where seasoned campers encountered terrors that defied all explanation. We will journey alongside experienced mountaineers, seasoned backpackers, and wilderness enthusiasts who ventured into places where civilization holds no power and darkness reigns supreme. The testimonies you will hear tonight have been carefully verified and cross-referenced, with every detail preserved to maintain their chilling authenticity. Though certain names and locations have been altered to protect the privacy of those who lived through these harrowing experiences. If you have not yet subscribed to Buried Files, join our community of truth seekers by hitting that subscribe button and activating the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the stories others dare not tell. Be sure to leave a comment below sharing your own wilderness encounters, or let us know which story disturbed you the most tonight. My name is Henry, and I have been backpacking in the Pacific Northwest for over a decade. I follow all the rules, obtain the proper permits, and respect leave no trace principles religiously. I tell you this because what I discovered in the Olympic National Park wilderness area challenged everything I thought I knew about how our protected lands are managed and who else might be using them. It was late September when I applied for a backcountry permit for a solo hiking trip in the Quinault River drainage. This is a restricted area that requires advance permits limited to only a few parties per day to protect the sensitive ecosystem. I had been trying to get a permit for this particular route for 3 years, and when one finally became available due to a cancellation, I jumped at the opportunity. The permit was for 4 days and 3 nights, allowing me to hike deep into old-growth forest and camp at designated backcountry sites. I had researched the area extensively, studied topographic maps, and read trip reports from other hikers. Everything indicated this would be a spectacular wilderness experience in one of the most pristine forest ecosystems remaining in the lower 48 states. I arrived at the ranger station on a Thursday morning to pick up my permit and receive the mandatory backcountry briefing. The ranger who processed my paperwork seemed unusually serious as she reviewed the regulations with me. She emphasized multiple times that I was to camp only at designated sites, that the permit system existed to protect sensitive areas, and that I should report any violations or unusual activity to park authorities immediately. When I asked if there had been problems with unauthorized camping in the area, she hesitated before answering that they occasionally dealt with people who entered restricted zones without permits. She advised me to be aware of my surroundings and to trust my instincts if anything seemed out of place. I began my hike around 10 in the morning, following the established trail into the Quinault drainage. The path was well maintained for the first few miles, passing through second-growth forest before entering the true wilderness area where old-growth cedars and Douglas firs towered overhead. The forest was cathedral quiet, with shafts of sunlight filtering through the canopy to illuminate patches of moss and ferns on the forest floor. My first designated campsite was approximately 8 miles from the trailhead, positioned beside a small creek that provided water access. According to my permit, I was the only person authorized to camp in this drainage for the next 3 days. The solitude was part of what made these permits so valuable and difficult to obtain. I reached my intended campsite around 4 in the afternoon, giving me plenty of time to set up camp and explore the surrounding area before dark. The site itself was a small clearing beside the creek with the established fire ring and a bear box for food storage. Everything appeared exactly as described in the park materials. But as I began setting up my tent, I noticed something that troubled me. There were signs of recent camping activity that did not match the official records. The fire ring contained fresh ash and partially burned wood that could not have been more than a few days old. More concerning, I found tent stakes in the ground that had obviously been used recently, and the vegetation around the campsite showed clear evidence of foot traffic. According to the permit system, no one should have been camping at this site for at least 2 weeks. The ranger station keeps meticulous records of backcountry use, and they would have informed me if there had been any recent activity in the area. I decided to investigate further before setting up my own camp. Following the creek downstream, I discovered additional evidence of recent human presence. There were more fire rings that did not appear on any official campsite maps, areas where vegetation had been cleared for tent sites, and even some improvised furniture constructed from fallen logs. Someone had been camping in this restricted area without permits, and they had established what appeared to be semi-permanent campsites in locations that were supposed to be off-limits to overnight use. As I continued exploring, I found a trail that branched off from the official hiking route. This path was not marked on any of the maps I carried, and it showed signs of regular use despite being in an area where off-trail travel was prohibited. The trail led deeper into the drainage, toward areas that were designated as research zones with no public access allowed. Following this unauthorized trail for approximately half a mile, I came upon a larger camping area that had clearly been in use for an extended period. There were multiple fire rings, several cleared tent sites, food storage containers that were not the approved bear-proof models, and even some basic shelters constructed from tarps and forest materials. This was not the casual camping of someone who had accidentally wandered into a restricted area. This was an established camp that showed evidence of repeated long-term use by people who knew exactly where they were and had chosen to ignore the permit system entirely. But what disturbed me most was not the unauthorized camping itself, but what I found scattered around the campsite. There were dozens of empty food containers, but not the kind that backpackers typically carry. These were institutional-sized cans and packages, the type used by large groups or commercial operations. I also found equipment that seemed out of place for recreational camping: heavy-duty generators, multiple radio antennas, and electronics equipment that would require significant power sources. Most troubling of all, I discovered what appeared to be research materials. There were waterproof containers filled with data sheets, photographs, and scientific instruments that I did not recognize. Some of the documentation had official-looking letterheads, but the text was partially obscured by water damage, and I could not read the details clearly. As I was examining these materials, I heard voices approaching from deeper in the forest. I immediately retreated from the unauthorized campsite and made my way back toward the official trail as quickly and quietly as possible. The voices were too distant for me to make out words, but I could tell there were multiple people, and they were moving toward the area I had just been investigating. I reached my designated campsite and quickly set up my tent, trying to appear as if I had been there all afternoon. My hands were shaking as I assembled my shelter, both from adrenaline and from the growing realization that I had stumbled into something much more complex than simple permit violations. The voices I had heard never came close enough to my official campsite for me to see who they belonged to, but I could occasionally hear them in the distance throughout the evening. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from the unauthorized camp I had discovered. Other times they appeared to be moving along trails that did not exist on any official maps. I spent a sleepless night in my tent, listening to sounds that suggested ongoing activity in areas where no one should have been present. There were occasional mechanical noises like generators running or vehicles starting, which should have been impossible in a designated wilderness area with no road access. Around 3 in the morning, I heard what sounded distinctly like helicopters passing overhead. This was extremely unusual as aircraft overflights in wilderness areas are heavily regulated and typically only occur for emergency rescues or official park business. When dawn broke, I made a decision that went against every backpacking instinct I had developed over the years. I decided to cut my trip short and hike out immediately. I broke camp as quickly as possible and began hiking toward the trailhead, constantly looking over my shoulder and listening for any signs that I was being followed. The 8-mile hike out felt longer than any distance I had ever covered, and I did not feel safe until I reached my vehicle in the parking area. I drove directly to the ranger station and requested a meeting with the backcountry supervisor. I detailed everything I had observed: the unauthorized campsites, the evidence of long-term occupation, the research materials, and the nocturnal activity that suggested ongoing operations in restricted areas. The ranger who listened to my report took extensive notes and asked detailed questions about locations and descriptions. However, her responses seemed carefully measured, as if she was being cautious about what information she shared with me. When I asked what actions would be taken to investigate the unauthorized activity, she told me that park officials would look into the matter, but that I should not expect to be updated on their findings. She also advised me not to discuss what I had observed with other hikers or on social media, explaining that premature publicity could interfere with any enforcement actions. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the National Park Service thanking me for my report and informing me that appropriate actions had been taken to address the violations I had witnessed. No details were provided about what those actions entailed or what they had discovered during their investigation. I attempted to obtain another permit for the same area 6 months later, but I was told that the Kino River drainage had been temporarily closed to all public access due to ongoing resource management activities. The closure notice provided no timeline for when public access might be restored. It has now been 18 months since my experience in the Olympic wilderness, and that section of the park remains closed to backcountry camping. I have tried multiple times to get information about the status of the area, but park officials will only say that the closure is necessary for resource protection and that they cannot provide a reopening date. I continue to backpack in other areas of the Pacific Northwest, but I have never again encountered anything like what I observed in the Kino drainage. The experience fundamentally changed my understanding of how our public lands are used and managed. I realized that there are likely legitimate scientific and administrative activities that occur in wilderness areas outside of public view. But what I witnessed did not feel like authorized government research or standard park management operations. The secrecy, the unauthorized camps, and the immediate closure of the area after my report suggested something much more complex and potentially troubling. I have never received a satisfactory explanation for what I encountered during those 4 days in September. The unauthorized activity, the research materials, and the subsequent closure of the area remain unexplained. Sometimes I wonder if I stumbled into something I was never supposed to see, and whether my report was actually welcomed by the park authorities or if it created complications for activities they preferred to keep hidden. What I know for certain is that our wilderness areas are not always as wild or as protected as the public believes them to be. There are people operating in restricted zones with apparent impunity, conducting activities that seem to contradict the very purpose of wilderness designation. I still obtain permits and follow all the regulations when I backpack, but I no longer assume that I am alone in the wilderness simply because the permit system says I should be. My name is Evelyn, and what I am about to tell you happened during what was supposed to be a romantic anniversary camping trip with my boyfriend Jack. We had been together for 3 years, and winter camping had become our shared passion. We were experienced cold weather campers who had successfully completed expeditions in temperatures well below zero. What happened to us in the boundary waters of Minnesota that February night destroyed not only our relationship, but my ability to trust my own perceptions of reality. Jack and I had planned this trip for months. February marked our 3rd anniversary, and we wanted to celebrate somewhere special. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness in winter transforms into a pristine, frozen landscape that few people ever experience. We had camped there twice before during warmer months, but winter camping offered a completely different kind of beauty and solitude. We drove up from Minneapolis on a Friday afternoon loaded with gear rated for extreme cold conditions. Our equipment list was extensive: 4-season mountaineering tent, sleeping bags rated to -30 degrees, insulated sleeping pads, portable winter shelter, and enough food for 4 days. We had also packed emergency gear, including a satellite communicator, first aid supplies, and extra clothing layers. The temperature when we arrived at the parking area was -12 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill bringing it down to -25. This was well within our comfort zone. We had camped in worse conditions and felt confident in our abilities and equipment. The weather forecast showed stable cold for the next 3 days with no precipitation expected. We began skiing into the wilderness area around 3 in the afternoon, pulling our gear behind us on sleds designed for winter camping. The snow was deep and well packed, making for excellent skiing conditions. Our destination was a small island approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, a location we had researched extensively and knew would provide good wind protection and flat ground for our tent. The ski-in went perfectly. We made excellent time despite the heavy sleds, and the scenery was breathtaking. The lakes were frozen solid, covered with a layer of snow that stretched unbroken to the horizon. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of our skis cutting through the snow and our breathing in the cold air. We reached our intended campsite around 5:30, just as the sun was beginning to set. The island was exactly as we had hoped, a small forested area with several level spots suitable for camping. We selected a location among a grove of large pine trees that would provide wind protection while keeping us away from any potential widowmakers overhead. Setting up camp in those conditions required teamwork and attention to detail. We had done this enough times that we moved with practiced efficiency. Jack began stamping down a platform for our tent while I organized our gear and prepared the site. The wind was minimal and the temperature felt manageable with our layered clothing system. Our tent went up without incident. It was a high-quality 4-season shelter that we had used many times before. We secured it with additional guy lines and snow anchors, ensuring it could handle any wind that might develop overnight. By 7 o'clock, we had camp established and were heating water for dinner on our reliable winter stove. The evening started perfectly. We cooked a hot meal, shared a thermos of hot chocolate, and spent time talking and enjoying the incredible night sky. At that latitude in winter with no light pollution, the stars were brilliant beyond description. We could see the Milky Way clearly, and the aurora borealis even made a brief appearance as green curtains dancing across the northern horizon. We retreated into our tent around 9 o'clock, settling into our sleeping bags with books and headlamps. This was always one of my favorite parts of winter camping. The cozy warmth inside the tent while the cold world existed just inches away beyond the thin fabric walls. Jack and I talked quietly about our plans for the next day and our gratitude for being able to share experiences like this together. The first sign that something was wrong came around 11 o'clock. Jack sat up suddenly in his sleeping bag and asked if I had heard something. I had not, but I listened carefully. After a minute or two, I heard it as well, a sound like something moving through the snow around our campsite. It was rhythmic, like footsteps, but heavier than what a person would make. We both remained silent, listening intently. The sound continued for several minutes, seeming to circle our tent at a distance of perhaps 20 or 30 feet. Then it stopped completely. Jack whispered that it was probably a deer or moose moving through the area. This made sense. Large animals do move at night, and we were in their habitat. We had encountered wildlife on previous camping trips, and it had never been a problem. But something about the pattern of movement troubled me. It had been too regular, too deliberate, and it had definitely been circling our camp, which was unusual behavior for most animals. We settled back down, but neither of us could fall asleep easily. Every small sound seemed amplified in the cold air. The normal creaking and settling of our tent in the wind sounded ominous. Even our own breathing seemed loud in the stillness. Around midnight, our stove malfunctioned. We had been using the same stove for 2 years without any problems. It was a high-quality winter model designed specifically for cold weather conditions. But when Jack tried to light it to melt snow for drinking water, it would not function properly. The flame was weak and inconsistent, and it kept going out despite his repeated attempts to adjust the settings. This was concerning because staying hydrated in winter conditions is critical. We needed to be able to melt snow for water, and we needed hot drinks to maintain our core body temperature. Jack worked on the stove for 20 minutes, trying different adjustments and checking all the connections, but he could not get it to work reliably. We decided to use our backup stove, a smaller model we carried for emergencies. But when Jack attempted to light it, we discovered that it was not working either. The igniter was clicking, but no flame would start. This should have been impossible. We had tested both stoves before the trip, and they had been functioning perfectly. Now we were facing a serious situation. Without a functioning stove, we could not melt snow for water or prepare hot food and drinks. In negative temperatures, this could quickly become a life-threatening problem. We had some water remaining in our bottles, but not enough to last through the next day. Jack suggested that we might need to consider cutting the trip short and skiing out in the morning. This was disappointing, but it was the prudent decision given the equipment failure. However, we still needed to get through the current night safely. It was while we were discussing our options that the temperature inside our tent began dropping dramatically. This made no sense. Our tent was designed for extreme cold weather, and we were both in high-quality sleeping bags. The temperature outside had not changed significantly according to our thermometer. But inside the tent, I could see my breath forming thick clouds, and I could feel cold air somehow penetrating our shelter. Jack checked the tent for any tiers or openings that might be letting in cold air. He found nothing. All the zippers were closed, and there were no visible holes in the fabric. Yet the temperature continued to drop. We put on additional clothing layers and pulled our sleeping bags tighter, but the cold seemed to seep through everything. Then we started hearing the breathing. It was not our own breathing. It was coming from outside the tent, slow and deep and deliberate. Something was standing very close to our shelter, close enough that we could hear its respiration clearly. The sound moved around the perimeter of the tent, sometimes stopping directly outside where our heads were positioned. Jack grabbed our flashlight and unzipped the tent door. The beam revealed nothing but undisturbed snow and the dark shapes of trees. But the moment he turned on the light, the breathing sound stopped completely. We waited for 10 minutes before closing the tent again. Within moments of zipping the door shut, the breathing resumed. This pattern continued for the next 3 hours. Every time we investigated with light, we found nothing. Every time we retreated into the tent, the sounds would return. The breathing was sometimes accompanied by other noises. The sound of something large moving through the snow, occasional scraping sounds against the tent fabric, and once, what sounded distinctly like sniffing, as if something was trying to identify our scent. By 4 in the morning, we were both showing signs of hypothermia despite our high-quality gear. Our core body temperatures were dropping, and we were shivering uncontrollably. This should not have been happening with our equipment and experience level, but our bodies were losing heat faster than we could generate it. Jack made the decision to activate our emergency satellite communicator and request rescue. In normal circumstances, this would have been embarrassing for experienced winter campers like ourselves. But something was fundamentally wrong with our situation, and our lives were potentially at risk. The rescue team reached us at 8 in the morning, skiing in with the emergency sled and additional warming equipment. They found us both suffering from mild hypothermia and dehydration. What they could not explain was why our gear had failed so completely, or why we had lost so much body heat in conditions that should have been manageable. The paramedics were puzzled by our stoves, which worked perfectly when they tested them. Our tent showed no signs of damage or air leaks. According to all physical evidence, our equipment was functioning exactly as designed. Yet we had nearly died from exposure in gear that should have kept us safe and warm. The rescue team skied us out to the parking area, where we were evaluated by medical personnel and released after warming up and rehydrating. Physically, we recovered completely within a few hours. Psychologically, the damage was permanent. Jack and I never went camping together again. We tried to discuss what had happened, but we could never agree on an explanation. He believed it was a combination of equipment failure and panic that had caused us to overreact to normal winter camping challenges. I knew that something had been stalking us that night, something that had deliberately sabotaged our equipment and systematically tried to drive us into hypothermia. Our relationship ended 2 months later. Some experiences reveal fundamental differences in how people perceive reality, and what happened to us in the Boundary Waters was one of those experiences. I never returned to winter camping. The memory of that breathing in the darkness and the knowledge that something had tried to kill us through cold and fear changed my relationship with the wilderness forever. My name is Abigail, and this story involves my boyfriend Samuel and myself. We are what you might call overlanders, people who prefer to find remote camping spots accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicles rather than staying in established campgrounds. We have been exploring Forest Service roads throughout the Pacific Northwest for 5 years, seeking solitude and pristine camping locations far from crowds. What happened to us on a remote Forest Service road in Oregon's Cascade Mountains changed our approach to wilderness camping forever. It was early October when Samuel and I decided to explore an area of the Willamette National Forest that we had never visited before. We had been studying Forest Service maps and satellite imagery for weeks, identifying a network of Forest Service roads that appeared to provide access to high-elevation meadows and old-growth forest areas. These roads were marked on maps but showed no recent maintenance dates, which usually indicated minimal traffic and excellent dispersed camping opportunities. Our vehicle was well equipped for Forest Service road travel. A lifted four-wheel drive pickup truck with oversized tires, recovery equipment, and a complete camping setup in the truck bed. We carried enough food, water, and fuel for a week of self-sufficient camping, along with communication equipment including a satellite messenger for emergencies. We left Portland on a Friday afternoon, driving east toward the Cascade Mountains. Our plan was to access the Forest Service road network from Highway 22, then explore several branching roads until we found a suitable camping location for the weekend. The weather forecast was favorable, with clear skies and mild temperatures expected for the next 3 days. The first part of our journey proceeded exactly as planned. We turned off the highway onto Forest Service Road 2261, a well-maintained gravel road that provided access to several wilderness trailheads. Traffic was light, consisting mainly of other weekend recreationalists heading to established camping areas. After approximately 15 miles, we turned onto a smaller Forest Service road that branched north toward our target area. This road was narrower and showed less maintenance, but it was still easily passable with our vehicle. The surrounding forest was beautiful, with dense stands of Douglas fir and occasional openings that provided views of distant peaks. As we continued deeper into the Forest Service road system, the roads became progressively narrower and more challenging. We passed through several intersections where our GPS showed multiple branching routes, some of which were not marked with road numbers or destination signs. We carefully tracked our route, making notes about landmarks and road conditions so we could find our way back to the main highway. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we found what appeared to be an ideal camping location. A small meadow beside a creek accessible by a short spur road that ended in a natural parking area. The site offered level ground for camping, water access, and excellent views of the surrounding forest. Most importantly, it showed no signs of recent human activity, which suggested we would have complete privacy for the weekend. Samuel parked the truck at the edge of the meadow and we began setting up our campsite. We established our kitchen area, deployed our camping chairs, and prepared to enjoy a peaceful evening in the wilderness. Everything felt perfect. The location was exactly what we had hoped to find: beautiful, remote, and completely private. As the sun began to set, we prepared dinner and opened a bottle of wine to celebrate finding such an excellent camping spot. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of water moving in the nearby creek and the occasional call of birds settling in for the night. This was what we loved most about overlanding: the ability to reach places where we could experience true solitude and connection with nature. It was around 8 o'clock when we first noticed the tire tracks. Samuel had walked down to the creek to collect water for cleaning our dishes when he called me over to look at something. In the soft earth beside the water, there were fresh tire tracks that clearly had not been there when we arrived. The tracks were from a large vehicle much bigger than our pickup truck, and they led from the creek bank back toward the Forest Service road. This was puzzling because we had not heard any vehicles pass our location since we had arrived. The Forest Service road we had used to reach this area was the only access route, and it passed within 50 yards of our campsite. Any vehicle large enough to make those tracks should have been clearly audible as it approached and departed. We followed the tire tracks back toward the main road, using our flashlights to examine the ground carefully. The tracks were definitely fresh, made within the last few hours, and they showed tread patterns consistent with heavy-duty truck or equipment tires. But when we reached the Forest Service road, the tracks seemed to disappear on the harder packed surface. Samuel suggested that we might have missed seeing a vehicle while we were busy setting up camp or preparing dinner. This seemed like the most logical explanation, although neither of us could understand how we could have failed to hear a large truck passing so close to our location. We returned to our campsite, but the discovery of the mysterious tire tracks had created an undercurrent of unease that affected the rest of our evening. We found ourselves listening more carefully to forest sounds, trying to distinguish between normal wildlife activity and any indication of human presence in the area. Around 10 o'clock, we decided to retire to our tent for the night. We had a comfortable sleeping setup in the back of our truck, which provided both security and elevation above ground level. As experienced overlanders, we always felt safer sleeping in our vehicle rather than in a ground tent when camping in remote locations. It was approximately midnight when we were awakened by the sound of vehicles. Multiple vehicles moving slowly along the Forest Service road without headlights. We could hear the low rumble of diesel engines and the sound of tires on gravel. But when we looked out through our truck windows, we could see no lights anywhere in the darkness. Samuel quietly opened the truck door and stepped outside to get a better view of the road. He whispered back to me that he could hear at least 3 different vehicles moving in convoy formation, all traveling without any visible lights. The sound grew louder as they approached our area, then began to fade as they continued past our location. We remained awake and alert for the next hour, listening for any indication that the vehicles might return or that people might approach our campsite. The forest had returned to its normal nighttime quiet, with only the usual sounds of wind in trees and water in the creek. In the morning, we investigated the Forest Service road where we had heard the vehicles passing. On the packed gravel surface, we found fresh tire tracks from multiple large vehicles. The tracks were deep and clear, indicating heavy loads, and they showed the same tread patterns we had found beside the creek the previous evening. More troubling, we discovered that some of the tire tracks led down a Forest Service road that our maps showed as permanently closed. There was a metal gate across this road with official Forest Service signs indicating that access was prohibited. But the gate was standing open and the lock appeared to have been cut recently. Samuel wanted to investigate further, but I argued that we should leave the area immediately. Whatever activity was occurring on these remote Forest Service roads after midnight involving multiple heavy vehicles traveling without lights was not something that recreational campers should become involved with. We were in the process of breaking camp when we noticed that we were being watched. There was a man standing in the tree line approximately 100 yards from our campsite. He was not attempting to hide, but he was also not approaching or making any effort to communicate with us. He simply stood there, watching our activities as we packed our camping equipment. Samuel called out a greeting, but the man did not respond. When Samuel began walking toward the tree line, the man retreated deeper into the forest and disappeared from view. We searched the area where he had been standing and found clear evidence that someone had been observing our campsite for an extended period. The vegetation was trampled in a pattern that suggested a person had been sitting or crouching in that location for hours. This discovery accelerated our departure preparations significantly. We loaded our truck as quickly as possible and drove back toward the main Forest Service road, constantly checking our mirrors for any signs that we were being followed. As we reached the first major intersection, we encountered a problem that confirmed our decision to leave the area immediately. A large tree had been felled across the Forest Service road, completely blocking our intended route back to the highway. The tree had obviously been cut recently, as the sawdust was still fresh and the cut showed clear chainsaw marks. Someone had deliberately blocked the road after we had passed through the previous day. Fortunately, Samuel had been carefully tracking our route, and he remembered an alternate Forest Service road that should connect back to the highway system. However, this alternate route required us to drive deeper into the area where we had observed the mysterious nighttime vehicle activity. We had no choice but to take the alternate route. As we drove along the narrow Forest Service road, we passed several locations where we observed clear evidence of recent heavy vehicle traffic and some kind of industrial activity. There were areas where vegetation had been cleared, large tire ruts and soft ground, and even some temporary structures that appeared to be equipment storage facilities. Most disturbing, we passed two locations where armed men in civilian clothing were stationed beside the road. They made no attempt to stop us, but they watched our vehicle carefully as we passed, and I had the distinct impression that our license plate number was being recorded. We reached the highway without further incident, but the drive back to Portland was tense and largely silent. Both Samuel and I felt that we had inadvertently stumbled into some kind of illegal operation, and we were uncertain about what actions we should take. After much discussion, we decided to report our observations to the Forest Service. We contacted the Ranger District Office and described the blocked road, the evidence of unauthorized vehicle activity, and the armed individuals we had encountered. The Forest Service representative we spoke with took detailed notes and thanked us for the report. However, when we asked what kind of investigation would be conducted, we were told that the information would be passed to appropriate authorities, but that we should not expect to be contacted with follow-up information. Samuel and I continue to explore Forest Service roads throughout the Pacific Northwest, but we have never returned to that area of the Willamette National Forest. We also changed our camping practices to include more careful research about recent activity reports and closer attention to signs that areas might be used for purposes other than recreation. The experience taught us that remote Forest Service roads are not always as unpopulated as they appear on maps, and that there are activities occurring in our national forests that recreational users are not supposed to witness. I have always considered myself an experienced mountaineer. Over the past 15 years, I have conquered peaks across the Rockies, the Cascades, and even attempted Denali twice. I tell you this not to boast, but to establish that what happened to me on Mount Elbert in Colorado cannot be dismissed as the hallucinations of an inexperienced climber or someone suffering from altitude sickness. My name is Luke, and what I experienced at 11,000 feet elevation changed my relationship with the mountains forever. It was early February when I decided to attempt a winter summit of Mount Elbert. The weather forecast showed a brief window of clear skies, and I had been planning this solo expedition for months. Winter mountaineering had always been my specialty. There is something profoundly peaceful about the silence of snow-covered peaks, the way the world becomes muffled and pristine. I had successfully completed winter ascents before, including several 14ers in similar conditions. This should have been routine. I began my ascent at 4 in the morning, headlamp cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as I navigated the snow-packed trail. The temperature hovered around -15 degrees Fahrenheit, but my gear was rated for much worse. I wore my standard winter setup: insulated mountaineering boots, 4-season tent, -20 sleeping bag, and enough food for 3 days. The weight of my pack felt familiar and reassuring against my shoulders. The first few hours of climbing progressed exactly as expected. I made good time despite the deep snow, following the established winter route with my GPS and compass as backup. The sun rose behind the eastern peaks, painting the snow in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was the kind of morning that reminds you why you chase these experiences, why you push your body to its limits in pursuit of something transcendent. By noon, I had reached the tree line at approximately 10,000 feet. This is where the landscape transforms from forested slopes to the harsh, wind-scoured terrain of the alpine zone. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees and the wind had picked up significantly. I stopped to add another layer and check my position. According to my GPS, I was making excellent progress and should reach my planned camping spot well before dark. The planned camping location was a small, relatively sheltered area at 11,000 feet, still below the summit but high enough to make the final push manageable the next morning. I had researched this spot extensively, studying topographic maps and reading reports from other winter climbers. It offered some protection from the prevailing winds while maintaining access to the summit route. As I continued climbing, the terrain became increasingly challenging. The snow was deeper than anticipated, sometimes reaching above my knees even with snowshoes. Each step required deliberate effort, and I could feel my heart rate elevated from the combination of exertion and altitude. But this was normal. This was what I had trained for. I reached my intended camping spot around 3 in the afternoon, giving me plenty of time to establish camp before darkness fell. The location appeared perfect, a small depression in the mountainside that would provide wind protection with relatively level ground for my tent. The snow was packed firm enough to support my weight without requiring extensive digging. Setting up camp at altitude in winter conditions is a methodical process that cannot be rushed. I began by stamping down a platform for my tent, then carefully assembled the structure, ensuring every stake was secure and every guy line properly tensioned. The wind was constant but manageable, creating that familiar whistling sound as it moved across the exposed ridges above me. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, I completed my camp setup and prepared dinner on my compact stove. The routine of melting snow for water, heating my meal, and organizing my gear for the night provided a sense of normalcy and control. I had done this dozens of times before. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. Darkness fell quickly at that altitude, the way it does in the mountains during winter. I retreated into my tent around 7 o'clock, settling into my sleeping bag with a book and headlamp. The wind continued its steady rhythm outside, occasionally gusting strong enough to flex the tent walls. This was expected and did not concern me. It was around 9 o'clock when I first heard the sound. At first, I dismissed it as wind moving through rock formations or perhaps settling snow. It was a low, resonant tone that seemed to echo from somewhere above my position. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the sound had a pattern to it. It would rise and fall in pitch, sometimes lasting for several seconds, then stopping completely before starting again. I unzipped my tent and looked outside. The night was clear, with stars brilliant in the thin air. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the surrounding terrain clearly. Everything appeared normal. The sound had stopped. I returned to my sleeping bag, convincing myself it was simply an acoustic phenomenon I had not encountered before. Mountains create strange sounds, especially at night when temperature differences cause rock to expand and contract. I had heard rockfall, avalanches, and ice cracking. This was probably something similar. But the sound returned an hour later, and this time it was closer. The tone was deeper now, more resonant, and it seemed to be moving. It would start from one direction, then shift to another, as if the source was circling my camp. I grabbed my headlamp and stepped outside again, scanning the area systematically. The beam of my light reached perhaps 50 yards in the clear air, illuminating nothing but snow and rock formations. The sound stopped the moment I turned on my light. I stood outside my tent for 15 minutes, listening and watching. The normal sounds of the mountain night surrounded me. Wind across stone, the occasional creak of settling snow, the distant hoot of an owl from far below the tree line. But the strange, resonant tone remained absent. I went back inside, but sleep became impossible. Every few minutes the sound would return. Sometimes it seemed to come from directly above my position, as if something was moving along the ridgeline overhead. Other times it appeared to originate from the valley below, echoing up the mountainside in a way that made it impossible to determine the exact location. Around midnight, the pattern changed. Instead of the long, sustained tones, I began hearing what sounded like voices. Not words I could understand, but definitely vocal sounds with the cadence and rhythm of speech. Multiple voices, sometimes overlapping, sometimes responding to each other in what resembled a conversation. This was when my rational mind began to struggle with what I was experiencing. I knew I was alone on this mountain. The winter climbing season meant very few people attempted these peaks, and I had seen no other vehicles at the trailhead. The nearest maintained trail was miles away, and the terrain between my position and any other possible camping areas was extremely difficult to navigate, especially at night. But I was hearing voices. I forced myself to consider logical explanations. Sound travels strangely at altitude, especially in cold, thin air. Perhaps I was hearing voices from much farther away than seemed possible. Maybe there were other climbers on a distant peak, and the acoustic properties of the terrain were carrying their conversation to my location. This explanation satisfied me for approximately 10 minutes, until I realized the voices were responding to my movements. When I shifted position inside my tent, the voices would stop. When I remained still, they would resume. When I unzipped my tent to look outside, immediate silence. When I retreated inside, the conversation would begin again within minutes. By 2 in the morning, I was questioning my own sanity. I had been at altitude for over 12 hours, which was not long enough for serious altitude sickness, but perhaps the combination of exertion, cold and thin air was affecting my perception. I checked my pulse oximeter. My oxygen saturation was 92%, which was normal for that elevation. My heart rate was elevated, but that could easily be attributed to stress and adrenaline. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the voices would start again. They seemed closer now, sometimes appearing to come from just outside my tent. I could hear the distinct sounds of movement in the snow, the crunch of footsteps circling my campsite. At 3:30 in the morning, something touched my tent. It was not the wind. Wind does not move with such deliberate pressure, pressing against the fabric from outside and then moving systematically around the perimeter. I could feel something tracing the outline of my shelter, running along the guy lines, testing the stability of the stakes. I grabbed my ice axe and headlamp, my heart hammering against my chest. Whatever was outside my tent was large enough to create significant pressure against the walls, and it was moving with obvious intelligence and purpose. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The movement stopped instantly. I waited in absolute silence for 5 minutes before slowly unzipping my tent. My headlamp beam revealed pristine snow around my campsite. No footprints, no disturbance of any kind. The snow lay exactly as I had left it when setting up camp, but I knew something had been there. I had felt its presence, felt the pressure of its movement against my tent. The physical evidence of my senses could not all be wrong. I spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting upright in my sleeping bag, ice axe across my knees, listening to sounds that defied explanation, and watching for movement that never materialized when I looked for it directly. When the sun finally rose, I broke camp as quickly as possible and began my descent. I never attempted the summit. I never returned to winter mountaineering. Some experiences change you fundamentally, and what happened to me at 11,000 feet on Mount Elbert was one of those experiences. I still do not know what I encountered that night, but I know it was real, and I know it was not human. My name is Dylan, and I have been kayak camping in the Great Lakes region for 8 years. I am an experienced paddler who has completed solo expeditions across Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan. I am familiar with the challenges of Great Lakes kayaking. Sudden weather changes, cold water temperatures, and the isolation that comes with camping on remote islands dozens of miles from shore. What I experienced on a small island in northern Lake Michigan during a solo expedition last summer was unlike anything I had encountered in all my years of wilderness paddling. I had planned a 10-day solo kayak expedition along the northern shore of Lake Michigan with the intention of island hopping between several small uninhabited islands that offered primitive camping opportunities. These islands are accessible only by boat and receive very few visitors due to their remote locations and the challenging paddle required to reach them. My route was carefully planned to take advantage of favorable weather windows and to provide bailout options in case conditions became dangerous. I carried a complete set of safety equipment, including a satellite communicator, marine radio, signal flares, and cold water survival gear. My kayak was loaded with 10 days of food, camping equipment, and fresh water. The first 3 days of the expedition went perfectly. I paddled approximately 20 miles per day, camping on 2 different islands that offered excellent campsites with fresh water sources and protection from prevailing winds. The weather was stable with light winds and mild temperatures, ideal conditions for Great Lakes kayaking. On the 4th day, I was paddling toward my planned destination when the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. What had started as a calm morning with light winds quickly developed into conditions with 4-foot swells and increasing wind speeds. The weather forecast had not predicted this change, but Great Lakes weather can be notoriously unpredictable. As the conditions worsened, I realized that continuing to my planned destination would be dangerous. I needed to find shelter immediately before the waves became too large for safe paddling. Consulting my chart, I identified a small island approximately 3 miles from my current position that could provide emergency shelter. The paddle to the island was challenging but manageable. The waves were building steadily, and I had to time my approach carefully to avoid being swept onto the rocky shoreline. I managed to land my kayak in a small protected cove on the leeward side of the island and dragged it well above the waterline before the conditions could worsen further. The island was smaller than I had anticipated from studying the charts, perhaps only 2 acres in total area. It was heavily forested with mature pine and cedar trees, and it showed no obvious signs of recent human visitation. There was no established campsite, but I found a relatively level area among the trees where I could set up my tent with some protection from the wind. As I was setting up camp, I discovered the first indication that this island had a disturbing history. While clearing an area for my tent, I uncovered what appeared to be the remains of a stone foundation, partially buried under decades of fallen leaves and forest debris. The stonework was clearly human-made, but it was much older than anything that should have existed on such a remote island. The stones were fitted together with a precision that suggested skilled craftsmanship, and the foundation appeared to be the remnants of a structure that had been deliberately dismantled rather than simply abandoned. I continued exploring the island while waiting for the weather to improve, and I made additional discoveries that increased my unease about this place. Near the center of the island, I found what appeared to be a small cemetery. There were no headstones or markers, but the ground showed clear evidence of graves. Rectangular depressions in the earth arranged in neat rows, each approximately 6 feet long. Some of the depressions were quite old, partially filled with debris and overgrown with vegetation. Others appeared much more recent, with disturbed soil and minimal plant growth. Most troubling of all, I found evidence that this cemetery was still in use. At the far end of the burial area, there were 2 graves that appeared to have been dug within the last few months. The soil was fresh, and there were tool marks visible in the earth around the grave sites. Someone had been bringing bodies to this remote island and burying them in this hidden cemetery, and they had been doing so recently. I also discovered remnants of what appeared to be a dock or landing area on the opposite side of the island from where I had made my emergency landing. The structure was mostly collapsed, but I could see the remains of wooden pilings and decking materials. This suggested that the island had been accessible by boat in the past, and that people had been transporting heavy materials or equipment to this location. As I continued investigating, I found additional evidence of the island's dark history. There were rusted metal objects partially buried throughout the forest, tools, containers, and what appeared to be restraints or shackles. I also discovered the remains of several buildings identifiable only by their stone foundations and scattered debris. The weather conditions prevented me from leaving the island that day, so I was forced to spend the night in a location that I increasingly suspected had been the site of activities I did not want to understand. I set up my tent as far as possible from the cemetery area, but the island was small enough that I could not escape the knowledge of what lay hidden in the forest around me. As darkness fell, I found myself listening intently to every sound, trying to distinguish between normal forest noises and any indication that I was not alone on the island. Around midnight, I was awakened by sounds that confirmed my worst fears. I could hear the low rumble of a boat engine approaching the island. The sound grew steadily louder, suggesting a large vessel moving slowly through the darkness without running lights. I remained in my tent, afraid to investigate but unable to ignore what was happening outside. The engine noise stopped, presumably when the boat reached the collapsed dock area on the far side of the island. For the next hour, I could hear voices and the sounds of people moving through the forest. They were not attempting to be quiet, and their conversation carried clearly through the still night air, although I could not make out specific words from my position. Most terrifying of all, I could hear the distinct sounds of digging. Someone was excavating in the cemetery area, working methodically with shovels and other tools. The digging continued for over 2 hours, accompanied by occasional conversation and the sound of heavy objects being moved. Eventually, the activity ceased, and I heard the boat engine start again. The vessel departed as quietly as it had arrived, leaving me alone on the island with the knowledge that I had witnessed something I was never supposed to see. I spent the remainder of the night sleepless and terrified, afraid that the people who had been on the island might return, and afraid of what I might discover if I investigated the cemetery area in daylight. When dawn broke, the weather conditions had improved enough for me to attempt departure. I broke camp as quickly as possible and prepared my kayak for launch, desperate to leave the island and its secrets behind. But before departing, I felt compelled to confirm what had happened during the night. I walked to the cemetery area and found exactly what I had feared. A new grave had been dug, and it had been filled and covered during the nighttime activity. The soil was fresh, and there were clear signs that a body had been buried in the location. I also found additional evidence that this was an ongoing operation. There were tool marks in trees that suggested the cemetery area was regularly maintained and expanded. I discovered a cache of digging tools hidden under a tarp, and I found what appeared to be a logbook wrapped in plastic and buried under a pile of stones. I did not examine the logbook closely, but I could see that it contained dates, numbers, and what appeared to be location coordinates. This suggested that the island cemetery was part of a systematic operation, with careful records being kept of the burials. I left the island immediately and paddled hard toward the mainland, covering the remaining distance to my planned exit point in record time. The crossing was challenging due to residual wave action from the previous day's storm, but I was motivated by an overwhelming need to reach civilization and report what I had discovered. When I reached shore, I contacted local law enforcement and provided a detailed account of my observations. The officers who took my report seemed skeptical at first, but they became more interested when I provided specific GPS coordinates for the island and described the evidence I had found. I was told that my report would be forwarded to appropriate authorities and that an investigation would be conducted, but I was also advised not to discuss my observations publicly while the investigation was ongoing. Several weeks later, I received a brief communication informing me that authorities had visited the island and had found evidence supporting my report. No details were provided about what actions had been taken or what they had discovered during their investigation. I have continued kayak camping in the Great Lakes, but I have never returned to that area of Lake Michigan. The experience fundamentally changed my understanding of how remote islands can be used by people who prefer to conduct their activities away from public scrutiny. I realize that there are likely legitimate explanations for some of what I observed, but the combination of the hidden cemetery, the nighttime burial activity, and the systematic record-keeping suggested something much more sinister than simple illegal dumping or abandoned property. What I know for certain is that some of the most remote and seemingly uninhabited places in our Great Lakes region are not as empty as they appear on navigation charts. There are people who use these isolated locations for purposes that they prefer to keep hidden from the general public, and recreational paddlers like myself can inadvertently stumble into situations that put us at risk. I still love kayak camping and exploring remote islands, but I am much more careful now about researching the history of locations before I visit them, and I always make sure someone knows my exact route and expected return date. My name is Elizabeth, and I have been alpine climbing in Colorado for 12 years. I am an experienced mountaineer who has summited over 30 peaks above 14,000 feet, including several technical winter ascents. I am familiar with avalanche safety, weather assessment, and high-altitude emergency procedures. What happened to me during a solo climbing attempt on Mount of the Holy Cross last winter challenged everything I thought I understood about mountain safety and the forces that operate in high alpine environments. I had been planning this particular winter ascent for 2 years, waiting for the right combination of weather conditions, snow stability, and personal schedule availability. Mount of the Holy Cross is a challenging peak under normal conditions, and winter attempts require extensive preparation and careful timing. The route I planned would take me through avalanche-prone terrain, but the recent snow conditions appeared stable according to the Colorado Avalanche Information Center forecasts. I began my approach on a Thursday morning in early February, carrying full winter mountaineering equipment including avalanche safety gear, emergency shelter, and enough supplies for 3 days. The weather forecast showed a brief high-pressure window with clear skies and minimal wind. Ideal conditions for a winter summit attempt. The first day of climbing progressed exactly as planned. I established a high camp at approximately 11,000 feet, well above tree line, in a location that provided some protection from prevailing winds while avoiding known avalanche paths. The evening was clear and calm, and all weather indicators suggested stable conditions for the summit attempt the following day. I woke before dawn and began my summit push at 4 in the morning, climbing by headlamp through the pre-dawn darkness. The snow conditions were excellent, firm enough to support my weight without requiring excessive energy expenditure. I made good progress up the standard winter route, carefully avoiding areas where avalanche danger might be elevated. As the sun rose, I could see the entire route ahead of me clearly. The snow appeared stable throughout the avalanche zones I would need to traverse, and there were no obvious signs of recent avalanche activity or unstable snow conditions. Everything suggested that my assessment of the conditions had been accurate and that the summit was achievable safely. It was around 9 in the morning when I first began experiencing the warnings. I cannot describe these warnings as sounds or voices in any conventional sense, but I was receiving clear mental impressions that I should not continue climbing. The impressions were urgent and specific, warning me about avalanche danger in areas where my own assessment indicated the snow was stable. At first, I dismissed these impressions as pre-summit anxiety, something that many climbers experience when approaching technically challenging terrain. But as I continued climbing, the warnings became more insistent and specific. I was receiving detailed information about snow conditions, weather changes, and route hazards that contradicted my own observations and the official avalanche forecasts. The warnings were telling me that I was climbing into an avalanche zone where the snow was much less stable than it appeared, and that continuing would result in being caught in a massive slide that would occur within the next few hours. I stopped climbing and conducted a thorough snow stability assessment, digging test pits and examining the snow layers carefully. Everything I observed confirmed that the snow was stable and that avalanche risk was minimal. The snow showed good bonding between layers. There were no obvious weak layers or faceted grains, and the weather conditions were not conducive to avalanche formation. But the warnings continued, becoming more urgent and detailed. I was receiving specific information about the exact location where the avalanche would initiate, the size and destructive power of the slide, and even the time when it would occur. According to the warnings, a massive avalanche would sweep the entire face I was climbing at approximately 11:30 in the morning, triggered by a cornice collapse high on the mountain that would occur when the sun warmed the snow structures sufficiently. I looked up toward the areas where cornices typically form on this peak, but I could see no obvious instability or signs that collapse was imminent. The cornices appeared well consolidated, and the warming from the morning sun had been gradual and moderate. Despite my rational assessment that the warnings were unfounded, I found myself unable to continue climbing. The mental impressions were so strong and specific that they overrode my technical knowledge and experience. Against my better judgment, I decided to retreat from the mountain and abandon the summit attempt. I began descending immediately, moving as quickly as safety allowed while still maintaining proper climbing technique. As I retreated, the warnings gradually decreased in intensity, but I continued to receive impressions that I should move faster and get below the avalanche zone as soon as possible. I had descended approximately 500 feet when I heard the sound that confirmed the accuracy of the warnings. High above my position, there was a sharp crack, followed by a low rumbling that quickly built into a roar. A massive cornice had collapsed exactly where and when the warnings had indicated it would, triggering an avalanche that swept down the entire face I had been climbing just minutes earlier. The avalanche was enormous, much larger than anything the current snow conditions should have produced. It carried thousands of tons of snow and debris down the mountain face, completely covering the route I had been following and extending far beyond the typical avalanche zones for this peak. If I had continued climbing according to my original plan, I would have been directly in the path of the avalanche when it occurred. The slide was so large and powerful that it would have been unsurvivable regardless of my avalanche safety equipment or emergency procedures. I watched the avalanche from my safe position below the debris zone, stunned by its size and destructive power. The entire character of the mountain had changed within minutes, with the avalanche depositing debris across areas that had been clear climbing terrain just moments earlier. As the avalanche settled and the mountain returned to silence, I realized that I had been saved by warnings that came from a source I could not identify or explain. The information I had received was completely accurate and much more detailed than anything my own knowledge and experience could have provided. I completed my descent to base camp and hiked out to the trailhead, constantly replaying the experience and trying to understand what had happened. I had received specific, accurate information about mountain conditions that proved to be correct despite contradicting all conventional assessment methods. When I reported the avalanche to the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, the forecasters were surprised by its occurrence and magnitude. According to their analysis, current snow conditions should not have produced an avalanche of that size, and there had been no indicators suggesting that such a slide was likely. The avalanche was eventually classified as an unusual event that occurred due to a combination of factors that were not apparent through standard snow stability assessment techniques. The cornice collapse that triggered the slide was attributed to subtle warming effects that were not detectable through normal weather monitoring. I have continued alpine climbing since this experience, but my approach to mountain safety has changed fundamentally. I now pay attention to intuitive impressions and warnings that cannot be explained through conventional assessment methods, and I have learned to trust these impressions even when they contradict my technical knowledge. I have spoken with other experienced mountaineers about this experience, and several have shared similar stories of receiving warnings or guidance that helped them avoid dangerous situations in the mountains. These experiences suggest that there are sources of information about mountain conditions that operate beyond our normal understanding of weather, snow science, and avalanche dynamics. I do not claim to understand the source of the warnings that saved my life on Mount of the Holy Cross, but I know that they were accurate, and that following them prevented me from being killed in an avalanche that should not have occurred according to conventional forecasting methods. The experience has taught me that mountain environments operate according to forces and patterns that are not fully understood by current scientific knowledge, and that experienced climbers need to remain open to information that comes from sources beyond traditional safety assessment techniques. I still climb regularly in Colorado's high peaks, but I approach each mountain with greater humility and respect for the unknown variables that can influence safety in high alpine environments. The mountains have their own intelligence, and sometimes that intelligence communicates with those who are willing to listen. What I know for certain is that there are protective forces operating in mountain environments that can provide crucial safety information to climbers who find themselves in dangerous situations. These forces saved my life, and I believe they continue to operate for other mountaineers who encounter conditions beyond their ability to assess through conventional means. The avalanche on Mount of the Holy Cross was a reminder that the mountains are much more complex and unpredictable than our current understanding suggests, and that survival sometimes depends on receiving and acting upon information that comes from sources we cannot identify or explain. My name is Chloe, and this story involves my best friend Grace and myself on what was supposed to be a week-long canoe expedition in the remote wilderness of northern Ontario, Canada. We are both experienced wilderness canoeists who have completed multiple expeditions in bear country and challenging remote locations. We are familiar with wildlife encounters, proper food storage procedures, and wilderness safety protocols. What stalked us during our trip into the Quetico Provincial Park wilderness was unlike any animal either of us had encountered before. Grace and I had been planning this expedition for over a year, researching remote canoe routes that would take us deep into pristine wilderness areas rarely visited by other paddlers. The route we selected would require 7 days of paddling and portaging through a chain of interconnected lakes and rivers, camping at remote sites accessible only by canoe. We obtained all necessary permits and completed extensive preparation, including bear safety training and wilderness first aid certification. Our food was stored in approved bear canisters, and we carried bear spray, noisemakers, and other wildlife deterrent equipment. We had canoed together for 6 years and felt confident in our abilities to handle whatever challenges the wilderness might present. We began our expedition on a Monday morning in late August, launching from a remote access point that required a 2-hour drive down logging roads to reach. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and calm water conditions ideal for paddling. Our canoe was loaded with 7 days of food, camping equipment, and safety gear, but we had packed efficiently and the weight was manageable. The first 3 days of the expedition were exactly what we had hoped for. We paddled through pristine wilderness areas, camped at beautiful remote sites, and encountered normal wildlife, including moose, beaver, and various bird species. The bear sign we observed was minimal and appeared old, suggesting low bear activity in the area. On the 4th day, we paddled into a large lake system that marked the most remote section of our route. According to our maps, we were now over 20 miles from the nearest road access, surrounded by hundreds of square miles of uninterrupted wilderness. The lake was beautiful, but somehow different from the waters we had been traveling. It felt more isolated, more wild, and strangely quiet despite its size. We established camp that evening on a small island near the center of the lake. The campsite offered excellent views in all directions and would allow us to spot any approaching wildlife well before it could reach our location. We followed our normal routine, setting up camp, hanging our food at the required distance and height, and preparing dinner before darkness fell. It was during dinner preparation that we first noticed something was wrong with the local wildlife behavior. The normal sounds of wilderness evening were absent. There were no loons calling, no beaver splashing, no sounds of birds settling for the night. The silence was so complete that we could hear our own heartbeats, and the small sounds of our camp activities seemed unnaturally loud. Grace commented that perhaps we had arrived during a natural quiet period, but I had spent enough time in wilderness areas to know that this level of silence was unusual. Something had caused all the wildlife in the area to become inactive or to leave entirely. We completed our dinner and evening camp routine, but both of us felt uneasy about the unnatural quiet. We decided to hang our food earlier than usual and to keep our bear spray easily accessible throughout the night. Around 10 o'clock, as we were settling into our tent, we heard the first sounds that indicated we were not alone on the lake. There was splashing in the water, but not the random splashing of fish or beaver activity. This was rhythmic and deliberate, like something large swimming in a straight line toward our island. The splashing continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly when it seemed to reach the shoreline of our island. Grace and I remained silent in our tent, listening carefully for any indication of what had approached our campsite. We heard nothing for approximately 15 minutes, then detected sounds of movement in the forest around our camping area. Whatever was circling our camp was large enough to break branches as it moved, but it was moving with unusual stealth for something of that size. We could hear occasional footfalls and the sound of vegetation being disturbed, but the movement pattern was unlike anything we had experienced with bears, moose, or other large wildlife. Most disturbing was the fact that it seemed to be deliberately circling our campsite, maintaining a consistent distance from our tent while moving systematically around the perimeter of our camp. We remained in our tent for over an hour, listening to the sounds of something moving through the forest around us. Occasionally, the sounds would stop completely and we would wonder if whatever it was had left the area. But then the movement would resume, always following the same circular pattern around our camp. Around midnight, Grace whispered that she was going to use her flashlight to try to see what was stalking us. I argued against this, preferring to remain hidden in the tent rather than reveal our exact location. But the uncertainty was becoming unbearable and we needed to know what we were dealing with. Grace slowly unzipped the tent and pointed her flashlight into the forest surrounding our campsite. The beam revealed nothing but trees and undergrowth, but the moment the light appeared, all sounds of movement stopped immediately. We waited for 10 minutes before closing the tent, but the forest remained completely silent. Whatever had been circling our camp had either left the area or had stopped moving when we attempted to observe it. The pattern continued throughout the night. Whenever we tried to investigate with light, the sounds would stop. Whenever we retreated into the tent and turned off our lights, the movement would resume within minutes. By dawn, both Grace and I were exhausted and terrified. We had spent the entire night listening to something large and intelligent stalking our campsite, but we had been unable to identify what it was or determine its intentions. When sunrise provided enough light to examine our campsite, we discovered evidence that confirmed our fears about the previous night's activity. Around our tent, at a consistent distance of approximately 30 feet, there was a clear trail where something had been moving in a circle. The trail showed disturbed vegetation, broken branches, and occasional impressions in the soft earth. But the tracks were unlike anything either of us had seen before. The impressions were large, much bigger than bear paws or moose hooves, and they showed a foot structure that appeared almost human but with elongated toes and what looked like claw marks. The stride length suggested something with very long legs, and the depth of the impressions indicated substantial weight. Most unsettling was the intelligence demonstrated by the movement pattern. This was not random animal behavior or territorial marking. Something had deliberately and systematically circled our campsite for hours, maintaining perfect distance and changing direction when it encountered obstacles. Grace and I made the decision to cut our expedition short and paddle out immediately. We broke camp as quickly as possible and loaded our canoe, constantly watching the tree line for any signs of movement or additional wildlife activity. The paddle out was tense and exhausting. We maintained a fast pace, stopping only when necessary for portages and navigation. Throughout the day, we felt like we were being observed, although we never saw direct evidence of anything following us. During one portage, Grace discovered additional tracks similar to what we had found at our campsite. The tracks led from the water's edge up the portage trail, and then back down to the water on the other side. Something had been following the same route we were using, and it had been there recently. We completed the portage as quickly as possible and continued paddling, pushing ourselves to cover more distance than we had planned for a single day. By evening, we had reached a lake system that was only one day's paddle from our exit point, but we decided to continue paddling into the night rather than camping again in the wilderness. Using our headlamps and following our GPS, we paddled through the darkness until we reached the final lake before our exit point. We made a cold camp on a small island, taking turns staying awake to watch for any signs that we were still being followed. The night passed without incident, and we completed our exit the following morning, reaching our vehicle and civilization with profound relief. When we reported our experience to park authorities, they listened carefully but offered no explanation for what we had encountered. They did note that there had been other reports of unusual wildlife activity in the same area, including tracks that did not match known species and sightings of large animals that could not be positively identified. Grace and I continue to canoe together, but we have never returned to that area of northern Ontario. The experience fundamentally changed our understanding of what exists in the deep wilderness areas of Canada, and we now plan our routes more carefully to avoid areas with reports of unusual wildlife activity. What stalked us during those 2 nights was something that combined the size and strength of a large predator with intelligence and behavioral patterns that seemed almost human. It demonstrated patience, systematic thinking, and an understanding of our routines that went far beyond normal animal behavior. I do not know what species we encountered in the Quetico wilderness, but I know it was real and that it posed a significant threat to our safety. The remote wilderness areas of northern Canada contain mysteries that are not accounted for in any wildlife management guides, and canoeists who venture into these areas should be prepared for encounters that cannot be explained through conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. My name is Luke, and this is a different story from the one I shared earlier about high-altitude mountaineering. This experience occurred during a winter overlanding expedition in the remote Forest Service roads of northwestern Montana, where I had traveled to photograph wildlife during the harsh winter months. I am an experienced winter outdoorsman and photographer who has spent countless nights alone in my vehicle in remote locations. What happened to me during 3 days snowed in on a Forest Service road near Glacier National Park challenged my understanding of what exists in the deep wilderness during Montana's brutal winters. I had driven north from Missoula in early January, seeking opportunities to photograph wolves, mountain goats, and other wildlife that become more visible during winter months when snow forces them to lower elevations. My plan was to explore a network of Forest Service roads that provided access to wildlife habitat while allowing me to sleep in my truck, which was equipped with a camper shell, sleeping system, and emergency supplies for extended winter camping. My vehicle was a heavy-duty pickup truck with 4-wheel drive, snow tires, and recovery equipment. I carried enough food, water, and fuel for 2 weeks of self-sufficient camping, along with cold weather gear rated for Montana winter conditions. I also had communication equipment including a satellite messenger and emergency beacon. The Forest Service road I selected accessed high elevation areas that remained open to vehicle traffic during winter, though they were rarely used due to challenging snow conditions. According to my research, this road provided access to prime wildlife habitat and offered numerous camping opportunities for self-contained vehicles. I drove into the mountains on a Tuesday morning following the plowed main highway until I reached the turnoff for the Forest Service road system. The secondary roads had not been plowed, but they were passable with 4-wheel drive and showed evidence of occasional use by other winter recreationalists. For the first 2 days, everything went according to plan. I found several excellent wildlife photography locations and established temporary camps where I could observe animal activity during the early morning and evening hours, when wildlife was most active. The weather was cold but stable, with temperatures ranging from -10 to +15 degrees Fahrenheit. On Thursday morning, I drove deeper into the Forest Service road network, following increasingly narrow and challenging routes toward areas that my maps indicated would provide access to remote wilderness boundaries. The snow was deeper at higher elevations, but my truck handled the conditions without difficulty. Around noon, I stopped to photograph a herd of elk that was feeding in a meadow visible from the road. While I was setting up my camera equipment, light snow began falling. The weather forecast had predicted possible snow, but nothing that would create travel problems. However, the snowfall intensified rapidly throughout the afternoon. What had started as light flurries became heavy snow that significantly reduced visibility and began accumulating on the roads. By 4 o'clock, I realized that I needed to start driving back toward the main highway before the roads became impassable. But when I attempted to drive out, I discovered that the snow had already made the Forest Service roads extremely difficult to navigate. My truck was slipping and sliding despite four-wheel drive, and I was making very slow progress toward the main road system. The snow continued falling heavily, and I could see that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. As darkness approached, I made the decision to stop and wait for better conditions rather than risk getting stuck or sliding off the narrow mountain roads. I found a relatively level area where I could park safely and activated my emergency beacon to notify authorities of my location and situation. I settled into my truck for what I expected would be an uncomfortable but manageable night, planning to attempt driving out in the morning when I could see road conditions clearly. My truck was well equipped for winter camping, and I had experienced similar situations before without serious problems. The snowfall continued throughout the night, and by morning I discovered that my truck was partially buried and the roads were completely impassable. The storm had deposited over 2 feet of new snow, and the Forest Service roads would require plowing or significant warming before they could be used safely. I activated my satellite communicator and reported my situation to emergency services, providing my GPS coordinates and explaining that I was safe, but would need assistance to exit the area. I was told that road crews would clear the Forest Service roads as soon as weather conditions permitted, but that might require several days depending on additional snowfall. This was disappointing but not alarming. I had supplies for 2 weeks and was comfortable in my vehicle. I had been in similar situations before and knew that patience was required when winter weather created travel problems in remote areas. But on the second night of being snowed in, I began experiencing something that transformed a routine winter camping situation into a terrifying survival ordeal. Around midnight, I was awakened by sounds outside my truck that seemed to be human voices calling my name. The voices were distant but clear, coming from different directions around my camping location. They were calling Luke repeatedly, sometimes individually and sometimes in overlapping conversations. This was impossible. I was miles from any other people, snowed in on a remote Forest Service road that had been impassable for 2 days. There was no way anyone else could have reached my location on foot through deep snow in sub-zero temperatures. I remained in my sleeping bag, listening carefully to try to determine the source of the voices. They continued for approximately 20 minutes, sometimes seeming to move closer to my truck and sometimes fading into the distance. The voices sounded urgent, as if people were searching for me and calling for me to respond. Despite the apparent urgency in the voices, something about them felt wrong. The tone was too perfect, too consistent, as if someone was imitating human speech rather than actually speaking naturally. And the fact that they knew my name was deeply troubling, since no one else should have been aware of my presence in this remote location. I decided not to respond to the voices, instead remaining silent and hidden in my truck. After about half an hour, the calling stopped completely and the forest returned to its normal winter silence. The following night, the voices returned, but this time they were closer and more persistent. They seemed to be coming from just outside my truck, and they were not just calling my name but engaging in conversations that appeared designed to trick me into responding. The voices would call my name, then pause as if waiting for a response. When I remained silent, they would begin talking among themselves, discussing my situation and expressing concern about my welfare. They mentioned details about my location and circumstances that should not have been known to anyone else. Most disturbing was when the voices began imitating people I knew. I heard conversations that sounded like my family members and friends, discussing plans to rescue me and asking me to come out of my truck so they could help me. The imitations were nearly perfect, capturing speech patterns and vocal characteristics accurately enough to be convincing. But I knew that none of these people could possibly be present in this remote location during a winter storm. The voices were attempts to lure me out of the safety of my vehicle, though I could not determine who or what was making these sounds or why they wanted me to leave my truck. Throughout the third night, the voices became more aggressive and desperate. They began claiming that there was an emergency, that someone was injured and needed my help, that search and rescue teams were nearby and needed me to signal my location. The urgency in the voices was compelling, and there were moments when I almost convinced myself that I should investigate. But something deeper than rational thought warned me to remain hidden in my truck. Every instinct I had developed during years of wilderness experience told me that responding to these voices would be dangerous, regardless of how convincing they sounded. The voices continued until dawn, sometimes fading into the distance and sometimes seeming to come from directly outside my windows. Occasionally I heard sounds of movement around my truck, as if people were walking through the deep snow and examining my vehicle. But when I looked out through my windows, I never saw anyone or any tracks in the snow around my camping area. On the fourth morning, I heard the sound of actual human voices and machinery approaching my location. A search and rescue team had reached me using snowmobiles and a tracked vehicle, following the GPS coordinates I had provided through my satellite communicator. The rescue team was able to clear enough snow around my truck to allow me to drive out behind their tracked vehicle, following a route they had broken through the deep snow. The evacuation went smoothly, and I reached the main highway system without further incident. When I described the voices I had heard during the previous 3 nights, the search and rescue coordinator told me that they had received similar reports from other people who had been stranded alone in remote winter locations. He could not explain the phenomenon, but he said that people who spend extended time alone in extreme winter conditions sometimes experience auditory hallucinations or other perceptual disturbances. This explanation might have satisfied me, except for one detail that the rescue team discovered when they examined my campsite. Around my truck, at distances ranging from 20 to 50 feet, there were tracks in the snow that appeared to have been made by people walking in circles around my vehicle. The tracks were clear and well-defined, showing boot prints in patterns that suggested systematic surveillance of my camping location. But according to the rescue team, no search and rescue personnel had been to my location prior to their arrival that morning. The tracks had been made by unknown individuals who had somehow reached my remote location during the storm and had spent considerable time observing my truck. I never received a satisfactory explanation for the voices or the tracks. The experience convinced me that remote winter locations in Montana can host activities and encounters that are not accounted for in any wilderness safety training, and that survival sometimes requires ignoring apparently human voices that call from the darkness. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the mist-shrouded peaks and ancient hollows of the Appalachian wilderness with 8 disturbing accounts that will forever change how you view America's most legendary trail. In this episode, we will descend into the heart of these primordial mountains with harrowing tales of disappearances, supernatural encounters, and the primal terror that stalks those who dare to walk alone among these ancient ridges. Each narrative has been meticulously documented from the first-hand testimonies of hikers, rangers, and survivors who emerged from these mountains forever changed by what they witnessed in the deep woods. These are not campfire stories or urban legends, but authentic experiences shared by individuals whose lives were shattered by encounters with forces that defy explanation along the most remote sections of the trail. To safeguard the identities of those brave enough to come forward, certain names and identifying details have been carefully altered while preserving the chilling truth of their experiences. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for the most authentic and disturbing true horror content that explores the darkest corners of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another collection of buried secrets that demand to be told. And after you listen to these accounts, share your own Appalachian Trail experiences in the comments below, because we know many of you have encountered things on these mountains that you have never spoken about. My name is Ella, and I have been documenting wildlife behavior along hiking trails for the past 8 years as part of my work with the National Wildlife Federation. I thought I had seen every kind of animal behavior these mountains could produce, from the curious to the aggressive to the simply bizarre. What I witnessed last November on a remote section of the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina changed my understanding of how nature communicates with those who know how to listen. I was conducting a 3-day survey of bird migration patterns along a stretch of trail that runs through the Nantahala National Forest. This particular section sees very few hikers during late fall, making it perfect for observing wildlife without human interference. The area is known for its diverse ecosystem and the massive old-growth trees that tower over the narrow trail like ancient sentinels watching over secrets they have kept for centuries. On the morning of my second day, I was setting up my camera equipment at a scenic overlook when I noticed something unusual in the valley below. There was a small clearing about half a mile off the main trail where someone had obviously made camp recently. I could see the bright colors of modern camping gear scattered around the site, which struck me as odd because the area was not accessible by any marked trail that I knew of. Through my telephoto lens, I could make out what appeared to be a high-end tent, still fully erected along with camping chairs, a portable table, and other expensive-looking equipment. But there was no movement around the campsite, no sign of the people who should have been using all that gear. Something about the scene felt wrong, like stumbling across a movie set that had been abandoned in the middle of filming. What made the discovery even more unsettling was the behavior of the local wildlife. Ravens had gathered in unusual numbers around the campsite, at least 30 or 40 birds perched in the trees surrounding the clearing. They were not behaving like scavengers looking for food scraps, but rather like sentries maintaining watch over something important. Every few minutes, several of them would take flight and circle the campsite in a coordinated pattern before returning to their perches. I had studied raven behavior extensively during my career, and this was unlike anything I had ever observed. Ravens are highly intelligent birds with complex social structures, but they do not typically gather in large groups around human campsites unless there is something specific attracting them. Their behavior suggested they were guarding something or trying to communicate information about the site below. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I packed my camera and basic supplies, leaving my heavier research equipment at the overlook, and began the challenging descent into the valley. There was no established trail leading to the clearing, so I had to pick my way carefully, through dense undergrowth and over fallen logs, following what appeared to be an animal path that wound between the massive tree trunks. The ravens watched my progress with obvious intelligence, some of them flying ahead of me as if leading the way, while others remained behind as if ensuring I did not retreat. Their calls echoed through the forest in patterns that seemed almost conversational, as if they were discussing my approach and deciding whether I should be allowed to continue. As I got closer to the campsite, I began to notice other details that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The camping gear was indeed expensive and high quality, but it had been arranged in a way that suggested the occupants had left in a hurry. A camp chair was overturned and personal items were scattered around as if someone had been searching through them hastily. More disturbing was what I found when I examined the perimeter of the campsite. There were clear signs of a struggle in the soft earth around the tent. Boot prints were mixed with what looked like barefoot impressions, and the vegetation was trampled and broken in patterns that suggested someone had been dragged or had fallen repeatedly while trying to escape. I noticed that the ravens had fallen silent as I entered the clearing, watching me with an intensity that felt almost human in its focus. They seemed to be waiting for me to discover something specific, and their behavior made me increasingly certain that whatever had happened here was not a simple case of campers leaving their gear behind. Inside the tent, I found personal belongings that painted a picture of the missing occupants. There were 2 sleeping bags indicating a couple, along with identification cards that showed they were experienced hikers from Virginia who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. Their names were Michael and Sarah Chen, and according to their hiking permits, they had planned to spend 5 days on this section of trail. What I discovered next made me realize that the ravens were trying to warn me about something far more serious than abandoned camping equipment. Behind the tent, partially concealed by fallen branches that appeared to have been deliberately arranged, I found evidence that someone had been digging in the soft forest floor. The depression in the earth was roughly rectangular and about 6 feet long, the exact size and shape that would accommodate a human body. The soil that had been excavated was piled nearby, along with a small camping shovel that clearly belonged to the missing hikers. But the hole was empty, and the displaced earth had been scattered to make it less obvious to casual observation. I realized with growing horror that I was looking at a burial site that had been recently disturbed. Someone had buried something here, then returned later to dig it up and move it elsewhere. The ravens had been guarding this location, trying to draw attention to what had happened in this remote clearing where no one would normally think to look. As I photographed the scene with my camera, documenting the evidence for the authorities, I became aware that the forest around me had fallen completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, no sound of wind in the branches overhead. The unnatural quiet was broken only by the soft whisper of raven wings as more birds arrived to join the growing congregation watching me work. I was so focused on documenting the scene that I almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps. The ravens heard it first, erupting into harsh warning calls that echoed through the trees like alarm bells. Someone was making their way through the forest toward the clearing, moving with the confident stride of someone familiar with the terrain. The bird's agitation told me everything I needed to know about the approaching visitor. This was not a lost hiker or a park ranger responding to my presence. The ravens were reacting to someone they recognized as a threat, someone they had encountered before in this place of violence and concealment. I grabbed my camera and quickly moved to the edge of the clearing, finding concealment behind a large fallen tree that provided both cover and a clear view of the campsite. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of branches being pushed aside and the occasional muttered curse as the person navigated the difficult terrain. When the figure finally emerged into the clearing, I understood why the ravens had been maintaining their vigil. The man was tall and heavily built, wearing camouflage clothing that was stained with what looked like dried blood. He carried a large backpack and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been to this location many times before. He went directly to the disturbed burial site and began examining the scattered earth with obvious frustration. It was clear that he had expected to find something there that was no longer present, and his anger at the discovery was evident in his movements and the low growls of annoyance that escaped his lips. The ravens watched him with obvious hatred, some of them diving at his head and forcing him to duck and swat at them with his hands. But he seemed accustomed to their harassment, as if this confrontation was a familiar routine that played out every time he visited this place. I realized that this man was almost certainly responsible for whatever had happened to Michael and Sarah Chen, and that he had returned to move evidence that would connect him to their disappearance. The ravens had been trying to prevent this by drawing attention to the site, hoping that someone would discover the truth before he could complete his cover-up. While he was distracted by the attacking birds, I managed to photograph him from multiple angles, capturing clear images of his face and distinctive clothing. But as I was adjusting my camera settings for better lighting, I accidentally knocked against the fallen tree I was hiding behind, causing a small branch to snap with a sharp crack. The sound carried clearly across the clearing, and the man's head snapped up immediately. His eyes scanned the forest around the campsite with the focused intensity of a predator searching for prey. The ravens fell silent, as if they too understood that my discovery had put me in mortal danger. I held perfectly still, hoping that my camouflaged position would keep me hidden. But the man began moving methodically around the perimeter of the clearing, searching for the source of the sound. He moved with the patient thoroughness of someone experienced in hunting human prey, checking behind every tree and fallen log large enough to conceal a person. As he got closer to my hiding spot, I made the decision to run. I burst from concealment and crashed through the forest in the direction I hoped would take me back to the main trail, branches whipping at my face and clothes as I pushed through the dense undergrowth at reckless speed. Behind me, I could hear him giving chase, his heavy footsteps pounding through the forest, accompanied by shouts of rage that echoed off the surrounding hills. But the ravens were not finished with their involvement in this deadly game. They launched themselves at my pursuer in coordinated attacks, diving at his head and face with their sharp talons extended, forcing him to slow down and defend himself. Their intervention gave me the precious seconds I needed to reach the animal path I had followed into the valley. I scrambled up the steep slope toward the main trail, my lungs burning and my heart pounding with terror and exertion. The ravens continued their assault on the man below, their harsh cries filling the forest with sounds of battle. When I finally reached the main trail, I ran until I found a group of other hikers who helped me contact the park rangers by satellite phone. Within hours, law enforcement officers were searching the area I had described, guided by my photographs and GPS coordinates. They found the disturbed campsite and the evidence of the burial site, along with other items that connected the location to several missing hikers over the past 2 years. But they never found the man I had encountered despite an extensive search of the area. The ravens had dispersed by the time the authorities arrived, their mission apparently complete. They had successfully drawn attention to the crimes committed in their territory and ensured that evidence was preserved for investigation. Michael and Sarah Chen were never found, but their disappearance is now part of an active investigation into a serial killer who targets remote hikers in the Appalachian wilderness. The case remains open, and authorities believe he is still active in the region. I still conduct wildlife research along hiking trails, but I pay much more attention to animal behavior that seems unusual or out of place. I learned that day that ravens are not just intelligent birds, but guardians of the forest who will risk their own safety to protect the truth from being buried forever. The mountains keep many secrets, but sometimes the creatures that live there decide that certain secrets need to be revealed. My name is Jonathan, and I have been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for over a decade. I thought I knew these mountains well enough to handle anything they could throw at me. I was wrong. What happened to me last October on a remote stretch through the Shenandoah National Park changed everything I believed about being alone in the wilderness. I had planned a 5-day solo hike through one of the more isolated sections of the trail, starting at the Rockfish Gap entrance and heading north towards Swift Run Gap. The weather forecast looked perfect for late fall hiking, crisp mornings and cool afternoons with clear skies. I had done this exact route twice before, so I felt confident about the terrain and water sources. What I did not account for was the man who would turn those 5 days into the most terrifying experience of my life. The first day went exactly as planned. I made good time on the familiar trail, stopping at my usual spots for water and rest. The autumn colors were at their peak, painting the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. I reached my planned campsite at High Top Hut just as the sun was setting behind the western ridges. The shelter was empty, which was not unusual for this time of year on a weekday. I set up my tent nearby and prepared a simple dinner, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest settling into night. It was the next morning when I first saw him. I was breaking camp around sunrise when I noticed a figure standing on the trail about 50 yards south of where I had camped. He appeared to be another hiker, wearing a dark jacket and carrying what looked like a large backpack. I waved in the friendly manner that trail hikers use to greet each other, but he did not wave back. Instead, he just stood there watching me pack up my gear. Something about his stillness made me uneasy, but I dismissed it as early morning grogginess affecting my perception. I finished packing and headed north on the trail. When I looked back after about 10 minutes of hiking, the man was gone. I assumed he had continued south on his own journey and thought nothing more of it. The morning was beautiful, with low mist hanging in the valleys and the sun filtering through the canopy in golden shafts. I made good progress toward my next planned stop at Lewis Mountain. Around midday, I stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook that provided sweeping views of the valley below. While I was eating my trail mix and drinking water, I heard footsteps approaching on the trail behind me. I turned to see the same man from the morning, now much closer than before. He was middle-aged with graying hair and a weathered face that suggested he spent considerable time outdoors. His clothes were well worn but appropriate for hiking, and his backpack looked expensive and professional. He approached with what seemed like a friendly demeanor and asked if I was heading north on the trail. When I confirmed that I was, he smiled and said he was going the same direction. He introduced himself as Mark and asked about my planned route for the next few days. I found myself sharing more information than I normally would with a stranger, telling him about my planned campsites and daily mileage goals. Looking back, I realized this was my first real mistake. Mark seemed knowledgeable about the trail in the area, asking specific questions about water sources and trail conditions ahead. He mentioned that he had been hiking this section for years and knew all the best camping spots, including some unofficial sites that were not marked on the standard trail maps. His conversation felt natural and friendly, the kind of encounter that makes solo hiking more enjoyable. We hiked together for the rest of the afternoon, sharing stories about previous hiking adventures and discussing the best gear for different conditions. As evening approached, we reached the area where I had planned to camp for the night. Mark suggested an alternative site about half a mile off the main trail, claiming it had better water access and more protection from the wind. Against my better judgment, I agreed to check it out. The site was indeed beautiful, nestled in a small clearing beside a clear mountain stream. We set up our tents on opposite sides of the clearing and prepared dinner separately, though we continued talking across the distance. It was during dinner that Mark began asking more personal questions. He wanted to know where I lived, what I did for work, and whether anyone knew exactly where I was on the trail. He claimed he was just making conversation, but something about his tone made me uncomfortable. I gave vague answers and tried to change the subject, but he kept returning to questions about my personal life and hiking plans. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every small sound in the forest seemed amplified, and I found myself listening intently for any movement near my tent. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps moving around the perimeter of our campsite. They were slow and deliberate, not the random wandering of an animal looking for food. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, trying to determine if the sounds were coming from Mark moving around his campsite or something else entirely. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes coming close to my tent, sometimes moving toward the stream, but always maintaining that same careful, measured pace. I never heard Mark's voice or the sound of his tent zipper, which made me increasingly certain that he was not inside his tent where he should have been. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted and on edge. Mark was sitting by the cold remains of last night's fire when I emerged from my tent, looking as if he had been awake for hours. He greeted me cheerfully and asked how I had slept, showing no signs of fatigue despite what I was certain had been his nighttime wandering. I decided to pack up quickly and get back to the main trail, claiming I wanted to make an early start to cover more miles that day. As we hiked that morning, Mark began demonstrating knowledge about my hiking habits that he should not have possessed. He mentioned that I always stopped at the same overlook for lunch, that I preferred to camp near water sources, and that I typically hiked about 12 miles per day. When I asked how he knew these details, he laughed and said he was just good at reading people. But his answers felt rehearsed, and I began to suspect he had been watching me for longer than just the previous day. The situation became truly frightening when we stopped for a rest break around mid-morning. While I was drinking water and checking my map, Mark casually mentioned that I had set up my tent in exactly the same spot where I had camped on my previous hikes through this area. He described the specific tree I had tied my food bag to and the flat rock I had used as a table. Details that would be impossible to know unless he had been watching me on those earlier trips. When I confronted him about this knowledge, his friendly demeanor changed completely. His eyes became cold and calculating, and he smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. He told me that he had been following hikers on this section of trail for years, learning their patterns and habits. He said some hikers were more interesting than others, and that I had become one of his favorites to watch. I realized with growing horror that this man had been stalking me for years without my knowledge, probably during each of my previous hikes through this area. He knew my routines, my preferences, and my vulnerabilities. I was alone in the wilderness with someone who had been planning this encounter for a very long time. I told Mark that I needed to head back to the main trail immediately, but he blocked my path and suggested we continue hiking together to my planned campsite for that night. The way he said it made it clear that this was not really a suggestion. I agreed, hoping to find an opportunity to get away from him when we encountered other hikers or reached a more populated area of the trail. We hiked in tense silence for the next several hours. Mark stayed close behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing and the sound of his footsteps matching mine. Every time I tried to increase my pace, he matched it effortlessly. When I stopped to rest, he stopped too, always positioning himself between me and the direction we had come from. As afternoon turned to evening, I realized that we had not encountered a single other hiker all day, which was unusual even for this remote section of trail. Mark seemed to know exactly which routes would keep us away from other people, steering me toward lesser-used paths and alternate routes that bypassed the main camping areas. When we reached what he claimed was my planned campsite for the night, I discovered it was not anywhere near where I had intended to stop. We were in a small clearing completely surrounded by dense forest, with no visible trail markers and no sign that other hikers had ever used this location. The isolation was complete and terrifying. Mark began setting up his tent with practiced efficiency while suggesting I do the same. But instead of complying, I made the decision that probably saved my life. I told him I had forgotten something important back at our previous campsite and needed to retrace our route to find it. Before he could object, I dropped my heavy pack and ran. I crashed through the forest in the direction I thought would take me back to the main trail, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I pushed through the undergrowth. Behind me, I could hear Mark shouting and giving chase, his voice echoing through the trees with a rage that confirmed my worst fears about his intentions. I ran for what felt like hours, completely lost and panicked, until I finally stumbled onto a section of the main trail that I recognized. From there, I was able to navigate back to a road crossing where I flagged down a passing car and got a ride to the nearest town. At the local police station, I learned that Mark's real name was David Crawford, and he had been wanted in connection with several missing hikers in the region over the past 3 years. The authorities had been looking for him but had never been able to establish a pattern or predict where he would appear next. They found my abandoned pack at the campsite, along with detailed notes about my hiking habits and routes written in David's handwriting. There were also similar notes about other hikers, some of whom had been reported missing and never found. David Crawford was never caught. He disappeared back into the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, possibly still out there watching and following other unsuspecting hikers. I never returned to that section of trail, and I never hike alone anymore. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, remembering the sound of those careful footsteps circling my tent in the darkness. And I wonder how many other hikers he had watched and followed before he made his move. The mountains I once loved now feel like a hunting ground where predators wait patiently for the right moment to reveal themselves. That is why I am sharing this story. If you hike alone on remote sections of trail, trust your instincts when something feels wrong. The greatest dangers in the wilderness are not always the ones we prepare for. Three. My name is Ryan, and I have been solo camping in remote wilderness areas for over 15 years. I pride myself on being prepared for any situation these mountains can present, from sudden weather changes to dangerous wildlife encounters. But what happened to me last December near Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina taught me that some things in these ancient hills cannot be explained by logic or survival training. I had chosen a particularly challenging section of trail for my winter camping trip, a remote area that sees almost no foot traffic during the colder months. The isolation was exactly what I needed after a difficult year at work, and I was looking forward to several days of complete solitude among the snow-covered peaks. My planned campsite was located at a high-elevation clearing that offered spectacular views of the surrounding ridges during clear weather. The forecast had called for possible snow showers, but nothing that would prevent an experienced winter camper from enjoying a safe trip. I had packed all the necessary cold weather gear, including a 4-season tent rated for extreme conditions and a sleeping bag designed for temperatures well below zero. My food supplies were calculated for 5 days with an extra day of emergency rations, and I carried multiple methods of fire starting and water purification. The hike to my chosen campsite took most of the day, with the trail becoming increasingly challenging as I gained elevation. The temperature dropped steadily as afternoon turned to evening, and by the time I reached the clearing where I planned to spend the night, a light snow had begun to fall. The flakes were small and dry, creating a peaceful atmosphere as they drifted through the bare branches of the surrounding trees. I set up my camp efficiently, taking advantage of the remaining daylight to establish a secure base for what I expected would be a cold but comfortable night. The clearing was sheltered on 3 sides by dense forest, with the 4th side opening onto a dramatic view of the valley far below. I positioned my tent to take advantage of the natural windbreak while maintaining access to the scenic overlook. As darkness fell, the snowfall intensified significantly. What had been a light dusting became a steady accumulation that began to muffle all sound from the surrounding forest. I prepared a hot dinner and settled into my tent for the evening, listening to the gentle whisper of snow against the fabric walls and feeling grateful for the warmth of my sleeping bag. It was around midnight when I first heard the voices calling through the storm. At first, I dismissed the sounds as wind moving through the trees, creating audio illusions that can trick the mind during long winter nights in isolated locations. But as I listened more carefully, the sounds began to resolve into what seemed like human voices shouting for help. Somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite, the calls appeared to be coming from multiple directions, sometimes from the valley below, sometimes from the ridges above, and occasionally from the dense forest that surrounded my clearing on 3 sides. The voices sounded desperate and frightened, calling out words that were almost but not quite clear enough to understand through the muffling effect of the falling snow. My first instinct was to help whoever was in distress, but something about the situation made me hesitate. The voices seemed to be calling from locations that would be impossible for hikers to reach during a snowstorm, particularly in the middle of the night when visibility was essentially zero. The ridge lines they appeared to be coming from were accessible only by technical climbing routes that no sane person would attempt in these conditions. I unzipped my tent and listened more carefully to the pattern of the calls. They came in waves lasting for several minutes before fading away, then returning from a different direction with renewed intensity. The voices sounded like they belonged to different people, men and women of various ages, all calling for help with the same desperate urgency. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the acoustic properties of the sounds. They seemed to carry farther and clearer than should have been possible in the heavy snow, reaching my ears with a distinctness that defied the physical laws governing how sound travels through dense precipitation. The voices also lacked the breathless quality that would be expected from people struggling through deep snow in freezing temperatures. Despite my growing uneasiness about the situation, I could not ignore what might be genuine calls for help from lost or injured hikers. I dressed quickly in my warmest layers and grabbed my headlamp, GPS device, and emergency supplies. If there were people in trouble somewhere in the storm, I had a moral obligation to attempt a rescue even if the circumstances seemed strange. I left my tent and began moving in the direction of the most recent calls, which appeared to be coming from a ridgeline about half a mile northeast of my campsite. The snow was now falling heavily enough to limit visibility to just a few yards beyond my headlamp beam, and the accumulation was making travel increasingly difficult with each step. The voices continued to call as I struggled through the deepening snow, always seeming to come from just ahead of my current position. But no matter how far I traveled toward the sounds, they never seemed to get any closer. Instead, they maintained the same distance and clarity, as if the sources were moving away from me at exactly the same pace I was moving toward them. After what felt like an hour of difficult hiking through terrain that was becoming increasingly treacherous, I realized that I had traveled much farther from my campsite than I had intended. The GPS showed that I was now over a mile from my tent, having followed the voices up steep slopes and along narrow ridge lines that would be dangerous even in good weather conditions. The calls were still coming from ahead of me, but I was beginning to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. The voices never paused for breath, never showed signs of exhaustion despite calling continuously for hours, and never responded when I shouted back offering help and asking for their location. More disturbing was the realization that the voices were leading me along paths that would take me farther and farther from safety. Each time I tried to turn back toward my campsite, the calls would intensify from a different direction, creating an almost irresistible urge to continue following them deeper into the wilderness. I stopped at a small clearing and checked my GPS again, discovering that I was now dangerously close to an area marked on my map as containing steep cliffs and unstable rock formations. The voices were calling from just beyond the tree line ahead, in a direction that my map showed led directly to a series of dramatic drop-offs that would be invisible in the current weather conditions. With growing horror, I realized that the voices were not coming from people in distress, but were somehow intended to lure me toward the dangerous cliff area where a single misstep would result in a fatal fall. The pattern of the calls, always maintaining the same distance and always leading me in directions that took me away from safety, suggested a deliberate attempt to guide me into mortal danger. I turned off my headlamp and stood in complete darkness, listening to the voices continue their desperate pleas for help. Without the light to guide me, I could focus entirely on the acoustic properties of the sounds, and what I heard convinced me that these were not human voices at all. They had a hollow, echoing quality that suggested they were being produced by something that did not possess human vocal cords or respiratory systems. The voices also demonstrated knowledge of my position and movements that would be impossible for lost hikers to possess. They always called from locations that would draw me away from my campsite and toward increasingly dangerous terrain, adjusting their apparent positions based on my responses in ways that suggested intelligent coordination rather than random panic. As I stood motionless in the darkness, the voices began to change in character. The desperate calls for help gradually transformed into what sounded like attempts at conversation, with individual voices asking questions about my location and intentions. They wanted to know where I was camped, how long I planned to stay in the area, and whether anyone knew my exact route. The interrogation quality of these new vocalizations convinced me that I was dealing with something that was actively hunting me, using the universal human response to calls for help as a way to draw victims away from safety and into situations where they could be easily eliminated. The voices were mimicking human distress calls with the same predatory intelligence that allows certain animals to imitate the sounds made by their prey. I began moving as quietly as possible back toward my campsite, using my GPS to navigate in the darkness rather than risk using my headlamp to signal my position. The voices continued calling, but now they seemed frustrated and angry rather than desperate. They were calling my name, which I had never provided, and making increasingly specific references to my equipment and planned route. The journey back to my tent took nearly 2 hours, with me stopping frequently to check my GPS position and listen for changes in the pattern of the calls. The voices followed my retreat, always staying close enough to be heard but never close enough to be seen. They seemed to know exactly where I was despite my attempts at stealth, commenting on my progress and making threats disguised as offers of help. When I finally reached my campsite, I discovered that my tent had been disturbed during my absence. The guy lines had been loosened, causing the tent to sag and allowing snow to accumulate on the rainfly in patterns that would eventually cause structural failure. My food cache had been opened and scattered around the clearing, and my backup supplies had been removed from their protective containers and exposed to the storm. The damage was too systematic to be the result of curious wildlife, and too specifically targeted to be caused by random wind or snow accumulation. Something had deliberately sabotaged my camp while I was being led away by the voices, ensuring that I would return to find my shelter compromised and my supplies contaminated or destroyed. I spent the remainder of the night inside my partially collapsed tent, listening to the voices circle my campsite in the darkness. They no longer bothered with pretending to be human calls for help, instead producing sounds that seemed designed to create maximum psychological terror. The vocalizations included inhuman screams, mechanical grinding noises, and what sounded like recordings of previous victims pleading for their lives. At dawn, the voices finally stopped, and the snowstorm moved on to reveal clear skies and brilliant sunshine reflecting off the fresh accumulation. I packed my remaining gear as quickly as possible and began the hike back to the trailhead, abandoning my planned multi-day trip in favor of immediate escape from whatever had terrorized me through the night. During the descent, I discovered that the area around my campsite was marked with symbols carved into the bark of surrounding trees. The symbols appeared to be recent and were arranged in patterns that suggested some kind of territorial marking or warning system. Each symbol was accompanied by initials and dates going back several years, suggesting that other hikers had encountered similar experiences and felt compelled to leave evidence of their presence. I reported the incident to park authorities, but was told that similar reports had been filed by other winter campers in the Grandfather Mountain area over the past decade. The official explanation was that extreme weather conditions and isolation can cause auditory hallucinations and paranoid behavior in solo hikers, leading to misinterpretation of natural sounds as threatening voices. But I know what I heard that night was not a hallucination. Something in those mountains uses human voices as bait to lure people away from safety and into situations where they disappear forever. The carved symbols I found suggest that some hikers have managed to survive their encounters, but others have not been so fortunate. I still go winter camping, but never alone, and never in areas where other hikers have reported hearing unexplained voices calling through the darkness. Some mountains hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. My name is Chloe, and I have always believed that the mountains hold memories of everyone who has ever walked their trails. What happened to me last spring on a section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia proved that some of those memories refuse to stay buried in the past. I was completing a solo day hike on a lesser-known trail that connects to the main Appalachian Trail system through the Blue Ridge Mountains. The route is popular with local hikers but rarely sees visitors from outside the region, making it perfect for someone seeking solitude and quiet contemplation. The morning had started clear and warm, with the kind of perfect spring weather that makes the mountains feel alive with new growth and possibility. About 3 miles into my hike, I encountered a section of trail where thick fog had settled in the valley, creating an ethereal atmosphere that transformed the familiar forest into something mysterious and otherworldly. The mist hung between the trees like curtains, limiting visibility to just a few yards in any direction and muffling all sounds except the soft drip of condensation from the branches overhead. It was while I was navigating through this fog that I first saw the woman. She appeared suddenly on the trail ahead of me, materializing out of the mist as if she had been walking there all along. At first glance, she appeared to be another hiker, but as I got closer, I noticed several details about her appearance that seemed out of place for a modern trail user. The woman was wearing a long dress that appeared to be made of dark wool or similar heavy fabric. The dress reached almost to her ankles and had long sleeves with fitted cuffs that were typical of clothing from a much earlier era. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate upswept style that would have been fashionable in the late 1800s, and she wore what looked like leather boots that laced up to mid-calf height. Despite the unusual clothing, the woman appeared to be in distress. She was walking slowly and seemed disoriented, frequently stopping to look around as if searching for something or someone. Her movements had the quality of someone who was lost and becoming increasingly desperate to find her way. As I approached her, I called out a greeting and asked if she needed help. The woman turned toward me with obvious relief and began speaking in a voice that carried a slight accent I could not immediately identify. She told me that she was looking for her children, who had wandered off while they were picking berries in the woods near their home. She explained that she had been searching for them since early morning and was becoming frightened that something terrible had happened to them. The woman described her children in detail, a boy named Thomas who was 8 years old and a girl named Mary who was 6, both wearing clothes that would have been typical for rural children in the 19th century. What struck me as odd about her story was that she seemed to believe we were much closer to settled areas than we actually were. She kept referring to nearby farms and a local schoolhouse that should have been within walking distance, but I knew from my map that we were miles from any permanent structures or residential areas. I gently explained to her that we were in a designated wilderness area where no one lived permanently, and that the nearest town was over 10 miles away, by road. But rather than accepting this information, she became increasingly agitated and insisted that her home was just beyond the next ridge, in a valley where her husband was waiting for her to return with the children. The woman began walking again, moving with determined purpose in a direction that led away from the main trail and toward increasingly rough terrain. She seemed to know exactly where she was going despite the heavy fog that made navigation nearly impossible. I followed her, partly out of concern for her safety and partly out of curiosity about how she had ended up in this remote location dressed in period clothing. As we walked, she continued to describe her search for the missing children, providing details about their personalities and habits that painted a vivid picture of a loving mother's desperate concern. She told me about Thomas's fascination with small animals and how he often lingered behind the family when they went berry picking because he stopped to examine every interesting insect or bird he encountered. She described Mary as a cautious child who rarely strayed far from her mother's side, making it unusual for her to have wandered off without permission. The woman theorized that Thomas had discovered something particularly interesting, and that Mary had followed him to see what had captured his attention. Her descriptions were so detailed and emotionally authentic that I found myself becoming invested in the search for these children, despite growing evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. The fog seemed to be getting thicker as we moved deeper into the wilderness, and the temperature was dropping in a way that felt unnatural for the time of day and season. We had been walking for what felt like an hour when the woman suddenly stopped and pointed ahead into the mist. She claimed she could see her house in the distance, describing a 2-story wooden structure with a stone chimney and a large garden where she grew vegetables for her family. But when I looked in the direction she was indicating, I could see nothing but more forest disappearing into the fog. The woman began calling out to her children by name, her voice carrying a desperate urgency that made my heart ache with sympathy. She called for Thomas and Mary, repeatedly pausing between calls to listen for any response, but the only sounds that came back were the echo of her own voice and the continued dripping of moisture from the trees around us. It was then that I noticed something that made me question everything about this encounter. Despite the heavy fog and the fact that we had been walking for over an hour through difficult terrain, the woman showed no signs of physical exertion. She was not breathing heavily. Her clothing showed no signs of moisture from the damp air, and her elaborate hairstyle remained perfectly arranged despite the humidity and our movement through dense undergrowth. More disturbing was the realization that I had not seen any footprints behind her as we walked, even though the soft forest floor should have clearly shown the impressions left by her heavy boots. My own footprints were clearly visible in the damp earth, but there was no evidence that she was actually making physical contact with the ground as she moved. I stopped walking and watched her more carefully, trying to understand what I was actually witnessing. The woman continued moving ahead of me, still calling for her children, but her movements had a floating quality that suggested she was not entirely bound by the same physical laws that governed my own motion through the forest. When I called out to her, asking her to wait for me, she turned back with an expression of confusion and sadness that seemed to look right through me. She asked if I had seen her children, but when I tried to explain my growing concerns about our situation, she did not seem to hear my words. Instead, she resumed her search with renewed determination, moving deeper into the wilderness. I made the decision to stop following her and instead began trying to navigate back to the main trail using my GPS device. But when I checked the screen, I discovered that it was showing my location as several miles from where I believed we had been walking, in an area that my map indicated was largely inaccessible due to steep terrain and dense vegetation. As I stood trying to understand how I had become so disoriented, the fog began to clear slightly, and I realized that the woman had disappeared. One moment she had been visible just ahead of me, and the next moment she was gone, as if she had never been there at all. Her voice could no longer be heard calling for the children, and the forest had returned to its normal quiet morning atmosphere. I eventually found my way back to the main trail and completed my hike without further incident. But the encounter left me with questions that demanded answers, so I began researching the history of the area where I had met the mysterious woman. What I discovered in local historical records was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. In 1873, a woman named Catherine Mitchell had lived with her family in a valley that was later flooded to create a reservoir for a nearby town. According to newspaper accounts from that time, Catherine had taken her two young children, Thomas and Mary Barry, picking in the woods near their home on a foggy spring morning. The children had wandered away from their mother and become lost in the dense forest. Catherine spent days searching for them, refusing to give up hope even as the local community organized search parties to help look for the missing children. Neither the children nor Catherine were ever found, and the case remained one of the region's most enduring mysteries. The historical accounts described Catherine as a devoted mother who was known for her distinctive style of dress and elaborate hairstyles that reflected her upbringing in a prosperous family before her marriage to a local farmer. I believe that I encountered Catherine Mitchell that morning in the fog, still searching for her children after more than 150 years, unable to accept that they are beyond her reach. The mountains keep their memories alive, and some losses are too profound to be healed by the passage of time. The fog still settles in that valley on spring mornings, and sometimes hikers report hearing a woman's voice calling for Thomas and Mary in the mist. My name is Anthony, and I have been an experienced backpacker for 20 years. I thought I knew everything about navigation, survival, and the psychological challenges of solo wilderness travel. Last August, I attempted what should have been a simple 5-day section hike through the George Washington National Forest in Virginia. What happened to me during those 14 days changed my understanding of how the mountains can trap a person in ways that defy logic and explanation. I had planned a straightforward route covering approximately 60 miles of the Appalachian Trail, starting at Rockfish Gap and ending at Swift Run Gap. The section was familiar to me from previous hikes, and I carried detailed topographic maps, a GPS device, and a compass as backup navigation tools. My food supplies were calculated for 6 days, with an additional day of emergency rations, more than enough for the planned duration of the trip. The first day went exactly as expected. I made good time on the well-marked trail, stopped at familiar landmarks, and reached my planned campsite at the scheduled time. The weather was perfect for hiking, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures that made the journey enjoyable rather than challenging. I set up camp confident that I would complete the route without any significant difficulties. On the second morning, I began to notice subtle signs that something was wrong with my navigation. Trail markers that I remembered from previous hikes seemed to be in slightly different positions, and familiar landmarks appeared to have changed in small but noticeable ways. A distinctive rock formation that should have been on my left was now on my right, and a stream crossing that I remembered being shallow was now deep enough to require careful wading. I dismissed these discrepancies as failures of memory, assuming that my recollections from previous hikes were less accurate than I had believed. The GPS continued to show my position on the planned route, and the compass readings were consistent with my expected direction of travel. There was no reason to suspect that anything was fundamentally wrong with my navigation. By the third day, the inconsistencies had become impossible to ignore. I was encountering sections of trail that I was certain I had never seen before, despite having hiked this route multiple times over the past decade. The terrain was similar to what I expected, but the specific details were wrong in ways that suggested I was somehow following a parallel path through unfamiliar territory. More disturbing was the realization that I had not encountered a single other hiker since beginning the trip. The section of trail I was supposedly following normally sees moderate foot traffic, and I should have met at least a few other backpackers or day hikers during my first 3 days. The complete absence of other people began to feel unnatural and threatening. On the 4th day, I made a discovery that challenged my understanding of where I was and how long I had been hiking. I reached a campsite that I was certain I had used on my first night, complete with the distinctive fire ring and flat sleeping area where I remembered setting up my tent. But according to my GPS and the distance I had covered, I should have been 40 miles from that location. I searched the area carefully and found clear evidence of my previous occupation of the site. The remains of my campfire were exactly where I had left them, and I even found a small piece of gear that I remembered dropping during my first night. But the discovery made no sense given my understanding of my route and progress over the past 4 days. That night, I heard my own voice calling from somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite. The voice was unmistakably mine, calling my name and asking for help in tones of increasing desperation. The sounds seemed to come from different directions, sometimes from the trail ahead, sometimes from the forest to either side, and occasionally from behind me in the direction I had come. I remained in my tent knowing that whatever was producing those sounds was not actually me, despite the perfect replication of my voice and speech patterns. The calling continued for hours, sometimes pleading for rescue, sometimes angrily demanding that I come out and explain why I was hiding. The voices knew details about my life that only I should know, referencing specific memories and experiences with accuracy that was both impressive and terrifying. By morning, I had consumed more food than I should have used during my first 4 days, despite the fact that my appetite had been normal and I had not been eating larger portions than usual. When I checked my supplies, I discovered that I had only 2 days of rations remaining, along with the emergency day I had packed as backup. The GPS continued to show my position as being on my planned route, but the displayed mileage indicated that I had covered nearly twice the distance that should have been possible given the terrain and my normal hiking pace. The device showed that I had been hiking for 7 days rather than 4, despite my clear memory of only 4 nights spent in the wilderness. I made the decision to abandon my planned route and head directly toward the nearest road, hoping to reach civilization before my food supplies were completely exhausted. But when I tried to navigate toward the highway that should have been only a few miles to the east, I found myself returning to the same landmarks repeatedly, as if I was walking in large circles despite maintaining a consistent bearing on my compass. The forest itself seemed to be shifting around me, presenting different configurations of trees and terrain each time I passed through what should have been the same location. Trails that led uphill in one direction somehow led uphill when I turned around and retraced my steps. Water flowed in directions that contradicted the topography, and the sun seemed to move across the sky in patterns that did not match the expected seasonal progression. On what I believed was my 8th day, I discovered another campsite that contained evidence of my previous occupation. This time, I found the remains of multiple fires in different locations around the site, suggesting that I had used this same location several times during my journey. Personal items that I had no memory of leaving behind were scattered around the area, including pieces of gear that I was certain were still in my backpack. The psychological stress of the situation began to take a severe toll on my mental state. I started to doubt my own memories and perceptions, wondering if I was experiencing some form of breakdown that was causing me to misinterpret normal wilderness experiences as supernatural phenomena. But the physical evidence of my multiple visits to the same campsites could not be explained by psychological factors alone. My food ran out on what my journal indicated was day 11, though my memory suggested I had been hiking for only 8 days. I began rationing my emergency supplies while desperately searching for any sign of human civilization or other hikers who might be able to help me navigate out of whatever maze I had become trapped in. It was on day 13 that I finally encountered another person. A day hiker appeared on the trail ahead of me, walking in the opposite direction with the confident stride of someone familiar with the area. When I called out to him for help, he stopped and listened to my explanation of being lost and disoriented for nearly 2 weeks. The day hiker looked at me with obvious concern and told me that I was less than 2 miles from a major road crossing where I could flag down a ride to the nearest town. He gave me detailed directions that seemed simple and straightforward, pointing out landmarks that I should follow to reach safety within a few hours. But when I followed his directions, I found myself back at one of the familiar campsites I had used multiple times during my ordeal. The day hiker was nowhere to be seen, and there was no evidence that anyone had recently passed through the area. I began to suspect that he had been another manifestation of whatever force was keeping me trapped in this endless loop. On day 14, I finally escaped by abandoning all attempts at logical navigation and simply walking downhill while ignoring my compass and GPS readings. This approach eventually led me to a stream that I followed to a road where I was able to get help from passing motorists. When I was rescued, I learned that I had been reported as an overdue hiker 6 days earlier, and search teams had been looking for me throughout the area where I thought I had been trapped. But the searchers found no trace of my presence in any of the locations I described, and my GPS track showed a confused pattern of overlapping circles and impossible routes that covered hundreds of miles in terrain that should have limited me to much shorter distances. The medical examination I received after my rescue showed signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition consistent with someone who had been lost in the wilderness for exactly 14 days. But my planned 5-day hike should never have lasted that long, and I still cannot explain how I became trapped in a section of forest that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. I no longer hike alone in unfamiliar areas, and I always carry emergency communication devices that allow me to call for help regardless of my location. Some parts of these mountains operate according to rules that human understanding cannot grasp, and getting lost in them means more than simply losing the trail. My name is Natalie, and I have always been drawn to the hidden places that most hikers never discover. While others stick to marked trails and established campsites, I prefer to explore the forgotten corners of these ancient mountains where few have ventured. What I found last September in the caves beneath Blood Mountain in Georgia proved that some places are forgotten for very good reasons. Blood Mountain has always held a reputation for being one of the most mysterious and unsettling peaks along the entire Appalachian Trail. The name itself comes from a Cherokee legend about a great battle between rival tribes that stained the mountain's rocks red with blood. Modern hikers often report feeling uncomfortable while camping in the area, describing an oppressive atmosphere that seems to press down on them like a physical weight. I was drawn to explore Blood Mountain specifically because of these stories. As an amateur speleologist, I was particularly interested in the extensive cave systems that honeycomb the mountain's interior. Most of these caves are unmarked and uncharted, accessible only to those willing to venture off established trails and navigate through dense forest to reach hidden entrances. My research had identified several potential cave openings on the eastern slope of the mountain, in an area that sees virtually no foot traffic from regular hikers. I planned a 3-day expedition to locate and explore these caves, carrying specialized equipment including headlamps, ropes, and emergency supplies designed for underground exploration. The hike to reach the cave system took most of the first day, following game trails and unmarked paths through increasingly dense forest. The atmosphere on Blood Mountain was immediately different from other peaks I had explored. The forest was unusually quiet, with very few bird calls or sounds from small animals. Even the wind seemed muffled, creating an unnatural stillness that made every sound I made feel amplified and intrusive. I found the first cave entrance late in the afternoon, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and partially blocked by fallen rocks. The opening was larger than I had expected, easily wide enough for a person to enter without crawling. Cool air flowed out of the cave mouth, carrying an unusual smell that I could not immediately identify. The cave entrance led to a narrow passage that descended steeply into the mountain's interior. My headlamp revealed smooth limestone walls that showed clear evidence of water erosion over thousands of years. After about 50 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber with multiple tunnels branching off in different directions. It was in this main chamber that I made my first disturbing discovery. The walls were covered with carved symbols that appeared to be very old, etched deep into the limestone with tools that had left distinctive marks. The symbols were not random scratches or graffiti, but appeared to be organized into patterns that suggested some kind of written language or ceremonial markings. The carvings covered nearly every available surface in the chamber, from floor to ceiling, creating an overwhelming display that would have taken years to complete. Some of the symbols were simple geometric shapes, while others were more complex designs that resembled abstract representations of human or animal figures. What made the symbols particularly unsettling was their obvious age, combined with evidence that they had been maintained and refreshed over time. Some sections showed clear signs of recent work, with sharp edges and clean lines that contrasted with the weathered appearance of older carvings. Someone had been regularly visiting this cave to continue the work of whoever had originally created this underground gallery. As I photographed the symbols for later study, I noticed that many of them were arranged around small alcoves carved into the chamber walls. These alcoves appeared to be designed to hold objects, and several still contained items that made my blood run cold. There were animal bones arranged in specific patterns, collections of what appeared to be human teeth, and small bundles of organic material that had been preserved by the cave's cool, dry environment. The alcoves were clearly part of some kind of ritual system that had been active for a very long time. The variety of materials and their different states of preservation suggested that offerings had been placed here repeatedly over many years, possibly decades or even longer. I decided to explore one of the side passages leading deeper into the cave system, hoping to find more conventional geological features that would make the expedition feel less like trespassing in someone's underground temple. The passage I chose was smaller than the main chamber, requiring me to crawl in some sections, but eventually opened into another large space. This second chamber was even more disturbing than the first. The walls were covered with symbols similar to those in the main chamber, but these carvings showed clear evidence of being much more recent. Some were still sharp enough to catch and reflect my headlamp beam, as if they had been completed within the past few months. More alarming was the discovery of a makeshift altar in the center of the chamber. The structure was built from carefully stacked stones and appeared to be actively maintained, with fresh materials arranged on its surface. There were bones that still showed traces of flesh, plant materials that had not yet dried completely, and other organic substances that I preferred not to examine too closely. The altar was surrounded by a circle of symbols carved directly into the cave floor, creating a ceremonial space that was obviously still in regular use. Wax drippings around the perimeter indicated that candles or torches were frequently burned in this location, and the air carried the faint smell of smoke mixed with other odors that I could not identify. As I was documenting this second chamber, I began to hear sounds coming from deeper in the cave system. At first, I thought the sounds might be water dripping or wind moving through hidden passages. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that something large was moving through the tunnels beyond my current location. The sounds had a rhythmic quality that suggested deliberate movement rather than random animal activity. Whatever was making them was approaching my location slowly and methodically, pausing occasionally as if listening for sounds that would reveal my presence. I turned off my headlamp and waited in complete darkness, hoping that whatever was in the caves with me would pass by without detecting me. But the sounds continued to get closer, accompanied by what seemed like whispered voices speaking in a language I did not recognize. The voices had a chanting quality that suggested some kind of ritual or ceremony was taking place in the deeper parts of the cave system. The words were too faint and distorted by the cave acoustics for me to make out individual syllables, but the rhythm and tone suggested that multiple people were involved in whatever was happening. I realized that I had stumbled into an active ceremonial site that was still being used by people who would not appreciate the presence of an uninvited observer. The recent carvings, fresh offerings, and ongoing ritual activity meant that I was trespassing in a sacred space that was very much alive and protected. I began moving as quietly as possible back toward the cave entrance. But the passage seemed longer and more complex than I remembered from my initial exploration. I took several wrong turns and found myself in unfamiliar chambers that I was certain I had not seen before. The sounds of movement and chanting continued throughout my attempted escape, sometimes seeming to come from directly ahead of me, sometimes from behind, and occasionally from passages that ran parallel to my route. Whatever group was conducting their ceremony in the deeper caves was clearly aware of my presence and was possibly trying to cut off my retreat. When I finally reached the main chamber, I discovered that my route to the entrance was blocked. Fresh stones had been carefully arranged across the passage, not enough to completely seal it, but sufficient to make exit difficult and noisy. Someone had been in this chamber while I was exploring the deeper caves, and they had deliberately tried to trap me underground. I managed to move enough of the stones to squeeze through the passage and reach the cave entrance, but the effort took nearly an hour and made enough noise to alert anyone in the area to my location. When I finally emerged into daylight, I discovered that my camping gear had been disturbed and rearranged in patterns that matched the symbols I had seen carved in the cave walls. My tent had been collapsed and the fabric arranged in geometric shapes. My food supplies had been removed from their containers and organized into small piles that formed circular patterns around my campsite. Even my hiking boots had been repositioned to point toward the cave entrance in a way that seemed deliberately symbolic. I packed my remaining gear as quickly as possible and hiked out of the area without stopping to rest or eat. The entire descent from Blood Mountain felt like a retreat from something ancient and powerful that did not want its secrets exposed to the outside world. I never reported my discovery of the cave system to park authorities, partly because I had no desire to return to the area, and partly because I suspected that whatever was happening in those underground chambers was something that should be left undisturbed by outside interference. Blood Mountain keeps its secrets for good reasons, and some mysteries are better left unsolved by those who value their safety more than their curiosity. My name is Alexander, and I have been photographing wildlife in remote wilderness areas for over 12 years. I thought I had encountered every type of animal behavior these mountains could produce, from the curious to the territorial to the simply unpredictable. What stalked me for 3 days through the backcountry of Tennessee last October challenged everything I believed about the intelligence and intentions of the creatures that call these ancient forests home. I was conducting a solo photography expedition in the Cherokee National Forest, specifically targeting black bears during their pre-hibernation feeding period. This time of year offers some of the best opportunities to observe and photograph bears in their natural habitat, as they focus intensively on building fat reserves for the coming winter months. I had planned a 4-day backpacking trip to reach areas where bears congregate around natural food sources. The first day of hiking took me deep into old-growth forest where human presence is minimal and wildlife behavior remains largely uninfluenced by contact with people. I established my base camp near a stream that provided both water access and excellent sight lines for wildlife observation. The area showed abundant signs of recent bear activity, including fresh scat, claw marks on trees, and well-used trails leading to nearby berry patches. On the second morning, I encountered my first bear of the trip. The animal appeared at the edge of a clearing about 100 yards from my position, moving with the characteristic shambling gait of a large male black bear. I estimated his weight at over 300 pounds, making him one of the largest bears I had ever observed in the wild. I immediately began photographing him through my telephoto lens, excited by the opportunity to document such an impressive specimen. What struck me as unusual about this bear was his apparent awareness of my presence combined with his complete lack of typical bear behavior in response to detecting a human. Most bears will either flee immediately upon sensing people or display obvious signs of agitation and territorial posturing. This bear simply stood at the edge of the clearing and watched me with an intensity that felt distinctly unnatural. The bear remained motionless for nearly 20 minutes, never taking his eyes off my position. During this time, he showed no interest in foraging for food or engaging in any of the normal activities that would bring a bear to this type of location. He seemed to be studying me with the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. When the bear finally moved, he did not retreat into the forest as I expected. Instead, he began walking slowly along the perimeter of the clearing, maintaining the same distance from my position while changing his angle of observation. His movement had a deliberate quality that suggested he was positioning himself for a better view rather than simply passing through the area. I continued photographing his behavior but began to feel increasingly uncomfortable about the situation. The bear's actions seemed more calculated and purposeful than anything I had observed in over a decade of wildlife photography. He was clearly aware of my exact location and was actively choosing to remain in the area despite my presence. After completing his circuit of the clearing, the bear disappeared into the forest. But rather than feeling relieved by his departure, I had the distinct impression that he had not actually left the area but had simply moved to a position where I could not see him. The feeling of being watched persisted long after he had vanished from sight. That evening, as I prepared dinner at my campsite, I noticed movement in the tree line surrounding my location. The same bear was visible between the trees, positioned about 50 yards away and maintaining his vigil over my activities. He remained motionless except for the occasional movement of his head as he tracked my movements around the campsite. The bear's behavior was so unusual that I began to question whether I was actually observing a normal wild animal or something else entirely. His posture was wrong for a typical black bear, appearing more upright and human-like than the forward-leaning stance characteristic of his species. His movements also seemed too fluid and coordinated, lacking the somewhat clumsy quality that makes bears appear endearing despite their size and power. Throughout the night, I was aware of the bear's continued presence around my campsite. I could hear him moving through the forest in slow, measured steps that suggested he was patrolling the perimeter of my location rather than simply wandering through his territory. The sounds never moved far enough away to indicate that he had lost interest in my presence. On the third day, the bear began following me as I moved through the forest. He maintained a consistent distance of approximately 100 yards, always staying just within sight but never approaching close enough to pose an obvious threat. When I stopped to photograph other wildlife or scenic locations, he would stop as well and wait for me to resume hiking. The bear's tracking behavior was so precise and persistent that I began to suspect he had some specific purpose in mind beyond simple curiosity about my presence. He seemed to be herding me in a particular direction, appearing ahead of me on certain trails while remaining behind me on others, effectively controlling my route through the forest. Most disturbing was the bear's apparent ability to predict my movements and intentions. He would position himself at locations where I planned to stop for rest or photography before I had made any obvious indication of my intentions. He seemed to understand not just where I was going, but why I was going there and what I planned to do when I arrived. By the afternoon of the third day, I had become genuinely frightened by the bear's behavior. His actions suggested a level of intelligence and planning ability that went far beyond anything documented in scientific literature about black bear cognition. He was not simply following me out of curiosity, but was actively stalking me with what appeared to be deliberate intent. I decided to change my planned route and head directly toward the nearest marked trail that would take me back to civilization. But when I attempted to alter my course, the bear began displaying signs of agitation for the first time since our initial encounter. He moved closer to my position and began making vocalizations that did not sound like typical bear communications. The sounds he produced were lower and more complex than normal bear vocalizations, with a rhythmic quality that almost resembled attempts at speech. The vocalizations seemed designed to communicate specific information rather than simply express emotion or territorial claims. When I continued moving toward the main trail despite his obvious displeasure, the bear began following me more closely and aggressively. He would appear directly on the path ahead of me, forcing me to alter my route, then position himself to block alternative routes that would take me toward areas of higher human activity. I realized that the bear was actively trying to prevent me from leaving his territory, using his size and presence to control my movements in ways that kept me isolated in remote areas where no other people would be likely to encounter us. His behavior suggested that he had specific plans for our interaction that required continued isolation from outside interference. On my final night in the forest, the bear abandoned all pretense of maintaining distance from my campsite. He positioned himself less than 30 yards away and remained there throughout the night, never sleeping or relaxing his vigilance. His eyes reflected the light from my campfire with an intelligence that seemed distinctly non-animal in its focus and intensity. I spent that night awake and alert, keeping my fire burning bright and maintaining constant awareness of the bear's position. Several times during the night, he rose to his full height on his hind legs and remained standing for extended periods, a posture that black bears typically maintain only briefly for scent detection or threat assessment. At dawn, I packed my gear as quickly as possible and began a rapid hike toward the main trail. The bear followed me for the first several miles, but gradually fell behind as I maintained a pace that was faster than his preferred travel speed. When I finally reached the marked trail system, he disappeared into the forest without any sign of his previous intense interest in my activities. I reported the encounter to park rangers, but was told that unusual bear behavior is not uncommon during pre-hibernation feeding periods when the animals are under stress to build adequate fat reserves. The rangers suggested that the bear had simply become habituated to human presence and was exhibiting curiosity rather than threatening behavior. But I know what I observed during those 3 days was not normal animal behavior. The bear's actions showed a level of planning, intelligence, and purposeful intent that suggested something far more complex than a wild animal's response to encountering a human in its territory. I still photograph wildlife in remote areas, but I no longer venture into regions where large predators might view me as something other than a temporary intrusion into their domain. Some animals in these mountains operate according to rules that human understanding has not yet discovered. And crossing paths with them can lead to encounters that challenge our assumptions about the natural world. My name is Abigail, and I have been a trail guide and wilderness educator for over 15 years. I thought I knew every established path, unmarked route, and hidden trail in the Blue Ridge Mountains. What happened to me last June proved that some trails in these ancient hills exist according to their own rules, leading hikers not just to different places but to different realities entirely. I was conducting a solo reconnaissance hike to evaluate a new route for guided tours when I discovered a trail that appeared on none of my maps or GPS systems. The path was well maintained and clearly marked with professional trailblazers, but it branched off from the main Appalachian Trail in a location where I was certain no side trail had existed during my previous visits to the area. The trail markers were painted in the standard white rectangular blazes used throughout the Appalachian Trail system, but they included additional symbols that I did not recognize from any official trail marking system. The symbols appeared to be directional indicators, but they pointed in directions that did not correspond to any known destinations or trail intersections. What initially attracted me to explore this mysterious trail was its obvious quality and maintenance. The path was expertly constructed with proper drainage, stable footing, and clear sight lines that indicated professional trail building techniques. Someone had invested considerable time and resources into creating a hiking experience that rivaled the best sections of the official trail system. The trail began with a gentle ascent through mixed hardwood forest, typical of the region. The walking was pleasant and the scenery was spectacular, offering views of distant ridges and valleys that I had never seen from this particular vantage point. The path seemed to follow natural contours of the landscape while providing access to scenic overlooks and interesting geological features. After hiking for what I estimated was about 3 miles, I encountered the first group of other hikers using the trail. They were a family consisting of 2 adults and 3 children, all properly equipped with hiking gear and displaying the confident demeanor of experienced trail users. When I asked them about their destination and how they had learned about this particular route, they gave me information that made no sense. They told me they were hiking from Damascus, Virginia to Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, following what they described as the traditional Appalachian Trail route. But the location where I had encountered them was nowhere near the established trail corridor between those 2 points, and their described itinerary would require them to cover impossible distances given the terrain and their apparent pace of travel. When I tried to explain that they seemed to be off the main trail system, they looked at me with confusion and showed me their guidebook and maps. The materials they carried appeared to be official Appalachian Trail publications, but they described a route that differed significantly from the established trail I knew well. Their maps showed the path we were currently following as the main trail, with the route I considered standard marked as an alternate or emergency bypass. The family continued on their way, heading in a direction that should have led them into impassable terrain according to my understanding of the local topography. but they walked with confidence and certainty as if they were following a well-known and frequently traveled route toward a destination they expected to reach without difficulty. As I continued exploring the mysterious trail, I encountered several more groups of hikers, all of whom gave me similar information about their routes and destinations. They all believed they were following the standard Appalachian Trail, and they all carried maps and guidebooks that showed this path as the official route through the region. Most disturbing was the discovery that these hikers represented different time periods of trail use. Some carried modern lightweight gear and used current terminology for trail features and regulations. Others had equipment and clothing that appeared to be from several decades earlier, and they referenced trail conditions and landmarks that had not existed for many years. One elderly hiker I encountered claimed to have been following this route annually for over 40 years, beginning in the 1970s when trail maintenance and marking systems were less standardized than today. He described changes to the trail over the decades that matched the historical development of the official Appalachian Trail. But he was describing changes to a route that I was certain had never existed. As the day progressed, I began to realize that I was not simply exploring an unmarked trail, but had somehow entered a version of the trail system that operated according to different rules than the reality I thought I understood. The other hikers I encountered were not lost or confused, but were following a legitimate trail that existed parallel to the one I knew. The landscape itself seemed to shift subtly as I continued hiking. Familiar landmarks appeared in unexpected locations, and the views from overlook showed terrain configurations that differed from my memory of the regional topography. The changes were not dramatic enough to be immediately obvious, but accumulated over time to create the impression that I was walking through a familiar area that had been somehow altered or rearranged. By late afternoon, I had hiked much farther than should have been possible given the terrain and my normal pace. My GPS showed that I had covered over 15 miles, but my physical condition and energy level suggested that I had hiked only half that distance. The device also showed my location as being several miles from where I believed I was based on the landmarks and trail features I could observe. When I tried to turn back toward my starting point, I discovered that the trail behind me had changed. The path I had followed to reach my current location was no longer visible, and the blazes that had guided me this far now pointed only in the forward direction. The trail seemed to exist only as a one-way route that prevented hikers from returning to their point of origin. I encountered a group of 3 hikers who claimed to have been walking this same trail for several weeks, covering thousands of miles while maintaining the same pace and energy level throughout their journey. They described passing through dozens of towns and trail landmarks, but their physical appearance and the condition of their gear suggested they had been hiking for only a few days at most. When I asked them about their experiences on the trail, they told me stories about encounters with other hikers, trail conditions, and weather events that spanned multiple seasons and years. They seemed to be experiencing time differently than normal, living through extended periods of trail life while aging only days or weeks in the process. The 3 hikers invited me to continue traveling with them, claiming that the trail led to destinations and experiences that could not be reached by following conventional routes. They described a network of interconnected paths that existed throughout the Appalachian Mountain system, accessible only to those who abandoned traditional concepts of distance, time, and destination. As evening approached, I made the decision to leave the trail despite the apparent impossibility of retracing my route. I pushed through the forest in what I believed was the direction of the main trail system, fighting through dense undergrowth and difficult terrain in an effort to reach familiar territory. The journey back to known trails took several hours of challenging bushwhacking, but eventually I emerged onto a section of the official Appalachian Trail that I recognized. When I checked my GPS, I discovered that I was only about 2 miles from where I had first encountered the mysterious trail, despite having hiked over 15 miles during the day. I attempted to relocate the trail entrance the following day, bringing additional maps and GPS equipment to document its location and characteristics. But despite searching the exact area where I remembered finding the trailhead, I could find no evidence that such a path had ever existed. The forest showed no signs of trail construction or maintenance, and there were no blazes or markers in the area. I reported my experience to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and local park authorities, but was told that no unofficial trails existed in the area I described. The maps and GPS data I had recorded during my hike showed impossible routes through terrain that should have been impassable, and my photographic documentation revealed landmarks and trail features that did not correspond to any known locations. I have continued to search for the trail during subsequent visits to the area, but have never again encountered the path or the hikers who seem to exist within its alternate reality. Sometimes I wonder if they are still out there, walking endless miles through a version of these mountains where time and distance operate according to different rules, following trails that lead to destinations that exist only for those who know how to find them. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets, and some of the paths that wind through these ancient hills lead to places that cannot be found on any map or reached by conventional means. For those who stumble onto these hidden routes, the journey becomes more important than the destination, and the trail itself becomes a way of life that transcends the normal boundaries of time and space. Some hikers never find their way back from trails that exist beyond the edges of our ordinary world, and perhaps they no longer want to return to a reality that seems limited compared to the infinite possibilities they have discovered.